TrekProfiles Podcast, episode 36, recorded April 2020. This is the Trek Profiles Podcast, where each episode we sit down with a Star Trek fan, we learn their story, and then we try to figure out why this show means so much to them, to us, and to all of you. I'm John, your intrepid host of this whole enterprise, and I welcome you to this, the Trek Profiles Podcast, episode 36. If you wish to get in touch with us, you can reach us at feedback@trekprofiles.com or on Facebook or Twitter at TrekProfiles. Warning, as we record this, we have reached the end of Season 1 of Star Trek Picard, so all previous Trek content up to and including that point is fair game and may be discussed during this episode. You have been warned, humans. As always, my trusty sidekick and co-host is the by-the-book, big brothery, the busy as a bee M5 Multitronic unit. Say hello to the listeners, M5.
M5 stands by for instructions.
All right, let's do the news.
News displayed.
The Trek Profiles Podcast is an independent Star Trek podcast. If you'd like to support us, the best way to do that is to subscribe via your preferred podcasting platform. My guest for this one is the Star Trek newscaster Alex Perry, host of the weekly Trek show over on the wonderful Tricorder Transmissions podcast network. Given that my previous guest was Allison Pitt, host of the daily Star Trek news show, you might think that I'm doing a series on Trek newscasters or something, but I just thought I might mention that it's a funny coincidence of how the schedule came out. There was no grand plan or grand design or anything like that. Extensive show notes, links, and pictures for this episode are posted up at TrekProfiles.com, so if you want to see some of my guests' Star Trek collection, which is a topic of discussion in the show, you can head over there and find those pictures. There is no bonus material for this one. Surprisingly, Alex and I stayed on topic, so there isn't much of anything from the recording that didn't make it into the main interview. All right, let's do the Kobayashi Maru feedback from episode 34. That was one of my podcast extravaganza episodes where I had my former guests back on to ask me about Star Trek. So the M5 here was programmed by our friend Shashank Varu, and Barry DeFord asked the questions, and I, of course, was in the hot seat. Question 1. For every meal for the rest of your life, do you pick Food by Neelix or Borg nutritional supplements? Now, I think Neelix is awesome, and there is scant evidence that he's a bad cook, so I picked him, and y'all agreed by 62 to 38%. Question 2. If you were a Starfleet officer and were stuck in a mirror universe, which of these two would be preferable, the TOS version or the Discovery version? I picked TOS, and again, so did the Twitter tweets by 56 to 44%. Question 3. Without knowing the outcome, which time loop would you be rather stuck in? The TNG cause and effect one or the Discovery one created by Harry Mudd? I picked the Discovery one, mostly because there was a wild party in it, but y'all mostly really wanted to meet Captain Fraser, and the TNG episode won in a squeaker by 51 to 49%. Question 4. If there was no escape, which timeline would you rather live through? Kirk in the City on the Edge of Forever or Cisco and Far Beyond the Stars? I picked the TOS option, but in the online poll, it went for New York in the 50s, as seen on Deep Space Nine by 71 to 29%. And finally, question 5. If you had no alliance to a Star Trek government, which mission would you choose? A Tal Shiar one where the agent insists it's for a good cause, or a completely secret Section 31-1? I rejected the Romulan Tal Shiar stuff as insanity. I said, I'm not doing that. I said Section 31, and so did all of you by a crushing margin of 74 to 26%. As always, ladies and gentlemen, after each episode drops, I tweet these lightning round questions out on Twitter, so you can follow me there and have your say on this episode's questions. That's going to do it for the messages, communiques, news, and weather. Let's move on. M5, let's run the intelligence profile for this week's guest, and let's start the show.
M5 complies.
His favorite character is Picard, as in Jean-Luc, and his favorite ship is the Enterprise D. He loves Garak and the Cardassians in general. He's the host of Weekly Trek on the Tricorder Transmissions podcast network. He's originally from England, but currently hails from Washington, D.C., North America, Earth, in Sector 001. It's Alex Perry. Welcome, Alex, and thanks for being on the podcast.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm very excited to get you on the show, Alex, but I have to tell you the M5 demands that I ask you question 1. Are you a Star Trek fan?
Yes, John, I am.
And have you always considered yourself a Star Trek fan?
Yeah, I've been a fan since I was 6 years old. I remember the very first time I watched Star Trek. In the UK, they have, before you do Scouts when you're much younger, there's Cubs, and right before that there's Beavers. And
Beavers?
Yes, Beavers. And I was a beaver, John. I must have been 6 years old, and I remember, the sort of the gray shirt and this sort of odd little kind of tie thing where it was like two handkerchiefs and they sort of weave together and you put a little knot on them. And must have been Tuesday, Wednesday afternoon after school, and I returned home from Beavers one day, and I walked into the living room, I turned on the television, and I tuned it to BBC Two, which was the second of the BBC channels, and their playing was, I remember it vividly, the last 10 minutes of A Matter of Time from Star Trek The Next Generation's 5th season, the episode with Berlingoff Rasmussen, Max Frewer. It was one of the very last scenes of the episode when they discover, when it's the time pod is in the cargo bay and they discover all of the things that he has stolen, and they find out that he's actually from the past and not from the future, as he's been claiming the whole episode. And I caught it in the last 10 minutes, and this was the very first time I've ever watched this show, and I was instantly captivated. I remember going and telling my mum, "Oh, I just watched this, last few minutes of this really great show. It's going to have this profound effect on me, and I'm going to be 32 years old and still talking about it, and you'll never get away from this." And I seem to recall she was being very, as parents do, being very, sort of like, "Oh yes, fabulous, whatever."
Go get ready for dinner.
Exactly. And so from that point, I made a special note to get home earlier every week to watch the episode, and it just sort of snowballed from there. And yeah, 26 years later, I'm still at it.
My goodness. And it's very rare that I get people on who can actually remember the first moment they saw in Star Trek. But does that episode still hold a special spot for you, or is it just one of the many? It holds
a special spot in that it was the first, but it's probably not one I revisit all that often. I'll rewatch it as part of a Next Generation rewatch when I'm rewatching the whole show, but it's not one that I'll think, "Oh, I'm going to go back and watch A Matter of Time." I think the craziest thing about how deep it got into my soul as quickly as it did was, I think the next two episodes that came up right after that were Violations, that terrible episode about mind rape, and Hero Worship, that terrible episode about the kid who pretends he's Data as a way of getting over his trauma. And despite the fact that those are both bottom of the barrel episodes, for some reason I was in, I think that must have been close to the 30th anniversary, because either I'm conflating a large amount of time in my brain, or no, because I think there must have been about 2 years, because that would have been 1996. This was probably more like 1994. I think at the time, certainly in the UK, Star Trek was starting to sort of penetrate the popular consciousness. And so, I mean, certainly The Next Generation was, and Deep Space Nine had just come out, I guess, the year before in the US, and Voyager was sort of around the corner. So it was around that time when Star Trek was just starting to be sort of everywhere all of the time. And I was hooked. And then I remember at the time they were putting out I think my parents must have got me for my birthday that year a couple of the Next Generation two-parters on VHS, because they were, at that point, they were releasing them as like the feature-length edits. Mm-hmm. So I remember the very first time I watched The Best of Both Worlds, there was no break between part one and part two. It just rolled right through. So the whole thing about, part one and then the summer and then part two was just not something that, it just totally washed over me, because as far as I was concerned, it was one story. Yeah, I think they got me that and Redemption and Descent. And I think once I started watching those, I was like, all right, now I really am in. Got my first action figure. That set off a lifetime of being poor to spending too much money on Star Trek stuff. And off to the races.
Well, we'll talk more about collections in a minute, but One of the things that always have in my mind is remembering how much those VHS tapes cost back in the day. It was so expensive, so expensive. And, when I hear people today talk about, I won't pay for all access because it's $6 a month, I think, man, oh man, I dropped $80 to buy 2 episodes on VHS. It was stunning what they ended up costing.
Yeah. Fast forward to Voyager, probably season 4, 5, 6, and as Deep Space Nine was winding down, season 6, 7, and my allowance was £5 a month, and the Star Trek tapes would come out every month, and they would be £15, so I'd be able to get one a month. And then £15 for 2 episodes, which so that's $25 for 2 episodes. And so there are definitely the episodes that I had on tape, which was not a lot. By the time the DVD started coming out, I would say I probably had about 100 episodes on tape. But there was a while there where maybe I only had 20, 30, 40. Definitely burned through those episodes a lot quicker. But it also included real oddities, like I had the tape that had Basics Part 2 and Flashback on it, the first tape of Star Trek Voyager Season 3, and I'd probably watched Basics Part 2 10 times before I ever got around to watching Basics Part 1. So I knew how it ended, but I never saw how it started other than the, last time on Star Trek section.
It's funny you bring this up, Alex, because this is a conversation I find myself having with newbies all the time, is I hang out in some particular forums, Star Trek forums in different places. And I swear that about every week, there's some newbie who comes in and says, well, I need to know the proper viewing order and what series I should watch first and in what sequence. And I tell them none of that matters.
Right.
None of it. Yeah. None of it. Pay no attention to these people who are giving you these 17-page diatribes on the correct sequence. It's all irrelevant, because I hear so many stories like what you just said. I saw part 2 of this, and then I jumped into Deep Space Nine and I watched season 7, and then I watched season 2, and then I went back and I saw the rest, and that's one that's supposed to be serialized. It's all nonsense. That
was exactly how it was for me, because so I got into the show when I was 6 years old. Yeah, so I guess that would have been 93. And then in 95, my family moved to Saudi Arabia for a year. And while we were there, they had a bunch of American channels that were showing Voyager, like season 2 and Deep Space Nine, season 2 or 3, none of which I had ever seen. Then after a year, went back to the UK, sort of caught the other stuff. So my first watch through, until you got to probably 98, 99, which would have been late stage DS9 and sort of mid to late stage Voyager. Yeah, I was not watching it in order. It was just sort of, whatever was on. And I remember because I wanted to keep track of what I had watched, I got this big stack of lined paper, and I got this, and I had the Star Trek chronology, and I went through it and I wrote out the names of all of the episodes in order, and I would go through and tick them off as I saw them. And then I decided, see, this was, I tell Jim I was doing Trek ranks before it was cool. Then I decided...
You're referring to our friend Jim Morehouse from Trek Ranks. Right?
Yes. Then I decided I wanted some way to know whether I enjoyed the episode or not. So I put an F next to the name of the episode if it was a personal favorite of mine. The problem became, what happens if I decided something was a personal favorite, but actually maybe I liked it a little bit more than something I considered another personal favorite? So as a genius 7-year-old, I decided, well, then you just add a second F, right? F for favorite. So 1 F for it's a favorite. Well, 2 Fs if it's a double favorite. Well, I mean, that's still not a terribly sophisticated ranking system, because what happens if you like something even more than your double favorite? Well, John, it becomes a triple favorite. So F, F, F. I think by the time I finished with my little ranking system, which went pretty much all the way through Voyager Season 7, I had these all tacked up on the wall, just these lists of episodes.
Yeah.
I think the highest rated episode was probably like 8 Fs, because I couldn't think of anything more sophisticated than just to add a new F every time I thought, oh, I think I like that one a little bit more than last week's, which I liked at 7 Fs, therefore this one's an 8.
I identify with this story, Alex, because I don't know if you know this, but I've been live tweeting my way through Voyager, which I have not seen. And I have my own little rating scale, which I've explained numerous times, which is that, this is not like an absolute scale. This is the Star Trek rating scale. So a 2.5 out of 5 is a solid episode.
Right.
And like, I'm watching them in real time. I'm not like sitting there with all the episodes and trying to slot them in. So I'm really giving the ratings in the moment. So 2.5 stars, or 2.5 Spocks, as I call it, is not a bad rating. That's like a solid episode, right? And people like, there's no episodes less than 4, and I'm like, stop, just stop it. You know, you have to read my instruction manual to understand my tweets properly. I'm kidding.
And it's an extremely personal thing, right? I mean, I think ultimately, I think in some ways that's sort of what we struggle with a little bit on social media, and why it can get very aggressive very quickly, is because all of this is personal taste. Right? Like, there really is no objective way of saying what's great and what's not. I mean, on my list of favorite episodes are some real stinkers that, my favorite movie is a movie that lots of other people say is one of the worst. And that's
we're gonna get to that.
Yes, we will. And that's, and that's just how it goes, right? I watch it and I really like it. Other people watch it and they can't stand any moment of it whatsoever. So
it's great.
Yeah, so it's it is so personal, and you just sort of have to, and like Jim's Trek Ranks site where he's ranked everything, right? Totally personal to him. I think I probably have many disagreements with some of the placements of some of his episodes, but that's because those are the episodes that he responds to. Just in the same way that, I mean, that's the great thing about there being 800 hours worth of content to pick through, is you really can approach it and have a thoroughly individual experience that is entirely tailored to you and is not replicated by anybody else's experience, and still have it be meaningful and unique, and not something that anybody can turn around and say to you, well, you're wrong, or the way you're experiencing that is not correct. Because when there's 800 hours of stuff to pick through, I mean, the particular paths you can take through that 800 hours are so varied and so numerous that your ultimate experience of the whole is always going to be different. And it's always going to be different also, not just the first way that you move through it, but the most recent way you move through it, right? You just rewatched Voyager, so your opinion of Voyager is vastly different than it was when the show was on in 97, right? And now you're in this place where it has this whole different meaning and whole different value to you.
Sure.
And maybe will again when you come back to rewatch it 15, 20 years later. It's the fabulous thing about the franchise.
One of my favorite things is when they tweet at me and tell me I have the incorrect opinion about the episode, whether it's positive or negative, right? They're like, oh, that was a great episode and you have misunderstood it. I was like, I sometimes I feel like I have a Star Trek superpower in that I truly, I don't want to say I don't care. It doesn't bother me whether people agree or not with my opinions, and I don't get wrapped around the axle about it at all. Like, I just don't. And I'm okay if someone else likes an episode that I really dislike. And it is just not something in my psychological makeup. So I think it makes me well suited to do this. But I will say this, and it's interesting because when I started doing Trek Profiles, one of the concerns I had was, I think everyone's going to pick like the same 5 episodes and it's just going to be the same show over and over again. And I'm not sure how long I'm going to be able to do this.
City on the Edge of the Forever for the 30th time.
Right, or whatever it is. And it's not ever been that, because even when people pick the same episodes, the things that they bring is their personal experiences in their life and how that episode touched them. And those are unique and special stories. And so I think that makes it beautiful. One thing I want to ask you about, though, Alex, in one of the preparatory questions that I asked you before we started recording was, are you currently rewatching anything?
Yes.
And you told me no.
Yes.
So my question for you is, when you watch Star Trek in general, not so much right at this moment, but are you a disciplined rewatcher? Do you watch like particular series or particular seasons, or do you jump around? Do you do like a thematic view? Like some people like to watch all the Klingon episodes or Stardate Order. I mean, there's so many varieties. How do you like to consume it?
I wish I was that disciplined. So I go through phases. The last time I rewatched the whole franchise was for the 50th anniversary. And I actually just sort of stumbled into it. In August of 2016, I was feeling nostalgic about the original series, a show that honestly, up until that point, I had never really connected with. I was sure that I had seen every episode at some point, but I had attempted a few original series rewatches to make sure that I had seen everything by watching it all the way through. And I'd always given up like 6 or 7 episodes into the series and just said, I'm moving on to something else. And in August of 2016, for some reason, I don't know, it was a hot summer and I was the only one in the office. I worked for this really small company and for some reason, nobody else was there. And it was really quiet because I work in DC, which is always quiet in the summer because nobody's here. And I was like, I'm going to give this show another go. And I'll start off by watching some of the best episodes, and then I'll see if that will like ease me into it rather than just starting out Man Trap, where no one has gone before, and going on from there. And so I started jumping around and for some reason it finally clicked with me and I was like, okay, I get this show after many, many years of trying. It's clicked. And I ended up then saying, all right, so I think I did the first 5 where I was sort of jumping around. And then I said, all right, well, I'm going to go back to the beginning. I'll obviously skip those 5 as I get to them, but I'm going to roll through. And then I ended up watching the whole series, every series in order. And the way I like to do it when I do series rewatches is I do them in season order. So once you get to where the shows overlap, you are alternating series by season. So you do Voyager 4 and Deep Space Nine 5, then you do Voyager 5 and Deep Space Nine 6, or however it matches up, in sort of chronological order of the timeline of the show. Which actually, I've not done Discovery. I've not done a full watch through that has Discovery in it. But that does create some interesting questions about Discovery Season 2 and 3, because the way you should watch it, if you're doing it chronologically based on 22nd century, 23rd century, 24th century, 32nd century, would be you would watch Enterprise 1, 2, 3, 4, then you would watch Discovery 1, 2, then you would do TOS 1, 2, 3, animated series, 6 movies, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Picard, and then you would watch Discovery Season 3 right at the very end of the watch. I'd be curious I would like to do that once there's a bit more of Discovery. But then the other interesting question becomes, what happens if at some point Discovery goes back to the 23rd century and stays there in like season 5 or 6? Do you do Discovery 1, 2, 5, 6, everything else, Discovery 3, 4, or do you do something different? I don't know. That's the great thing about it, right? But right now, I am just doing comfort episodes. It's like, what do I feel like? What's one of the first episodes that pops into my head right now? That's the one I'm going to watch. And I would say there's probably a stable of about 50 to 60 that tend to sort of bop around in my head most obviously. But there will also be times where I'll just go, I just want to watch this other one for whatever reason. Like, I rewatched The Battle, the first season Next Generation episode, about a month ago, because in Picard season 1, there was a reference to a really old civilization that had the capability of moving stars. And I said, oh, that reminds me of the Takan who were in this episode, The Battle. So I was like, I'll rewatch The Battle. So, it's not a great episode. The model work, though, is really good. It's the first one where you get the Ferengi Marauder, and in high definition, the ship shots in that episode are just really incredible. The story itself is and the early season Next Generation Ferengi are but it's for actually for season 1 Next Generation, it's not the worst.
The thing I remember about that episode, whenever it comes up in my mind, is the Sentinel flipping that axe around and almost landing on Riker's head. That's the one little moment that's like stuck in my head from that whole episode, you know? But, well, that's interesting, because I'm curious, though, as to why a season order does anything for you, because to be honest, there's like very little overlap, I think, between a lot of these seasons. It just seems to me, but maybe I'm wrong. Fill me in, Alex. Am I missing something here?
I like the feeling when you can do it of putting time in between the season finale cliffhanger and getting back to the first episode again. You can't do it with like Best of Both Worlds because there's no other show to drop in the middle to separate the two. But it is fun when you're doing a whole series rewatch to go to watch Broken Link, the season 4 Deep Space Nine finale, and have it end on Gowron, the leader of the Klingon Empire, as a changeling, and then have to wait 26 episodes to get back to discover what the implications of that were. So once you're in the middle of that Deep Space Nine Voyager period, it's also fun because you sort of follow the evolution of the Federation, and they were pretty good about overlapping things that were going on in terms of like, you know, Voyager discovers that the Dominion War is happening, and anytime they're then talking to anybody in the Alpha Quadrant, they're all wearing the Deep Space Nine gray uniform rather than the uniforms that they're wearing. I just like that idea of the chronological progression of the show as a whole, and it feels weird to me to watch whole series at once, because when you're in that overlapping interim, once you get to the end and you go back to the beginning again, so once you get to the end of Deep Space Nine and then you go back to the beginning of Voyager, you are sort of moving backwards in time quite a ways, because you watch what you leave behind, and you've got Quark saying, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Massive character growth over 7 seasons. You pick up Caretaker, and you get that scene in Caretaker where Quark's being a real, you know, so-and-so to Harry Kim.
Yeah, trying to sell him a bunch of trinkets. Exactly,
and you're back at season 3 Quark all over again. So that's why I like to intersperse them. It gives you a little bit of the like cliffhanger, it sort of recreates some of that sort of joy of the cliffhanger, but it also allows you to sort of track and in many ways when you're in that 1990s track the sort of progression of the production through from 1987 all the way unbroken through to 2005.
So I assume then that you are a completist.
Oh, yes. The animated series was the last show that I watched, but I did manage to tough my way through every episode.
Oh, some of them are quite charming in their own way.
Yeah, some of them are quite charming in their own way. I think that is a show where I have not gone back and rewatched the episodes since the animated series. It's not a companion, but reference book came out last year.
Yes.
Which I was assigned the task of reading, reviewing, and interviewing the authors for TrekCore. And I'll be honest, I mean, before I sat down and read the book, I was dreading it because I hated the animated series. I mean, just hated it. And I was like, ugh, I'm sure I'm going to have to find something nice to say about the animated series. And I can't think of anything nice to say about the animated series at all. And I read the book, and I actually came away from it with a really profound appreciation for the show. And I did go back and rewatch one episode, and where previously, even yesteryear for me was like pulling nails down a chalkboard, like just an unbearably awful experience of like the 70s music and just the terrible, terrible, terrible animation that just didn't move and was more like a newspaper cartoon strip. I went back and rewatched it, and I was like, all right, I think I intellectually I get this show now. I will not necessarily cop to the fact that I enjoyed it, but I at least appreciated it. And I also grew to appreciate other people's love for it. And I also grew to appreciate the role that it plays in the history of the franchise. Without the animated series, nothing that came after comes after. And so it really is, it's not the kind of thing you can just chop out of the franchise history and just entirely ignore from the perspective of like what was important to Star Trek to make more Star Trek happen.
Yeah.
That was supremely important to Star Trek. But I'm still working on developing a love for it.
I know that you do a lot of canon connection type work, and it's been entertaining for me to see all the animated series references that are in the newer Treks in Picard and Discovery. There's been so many. I mean, so many. It's really been quite funny to see that.
Yeah, I may not love the animated series, but it's clear that that the writer's room of Discovery and Picard love the animated series.
No doubt.
You know, from, I mean, the Amanda reading Alice in Wonderland to Burnham and Spock when they were children, some of the yesteryear stuff.
Kazinti.
Kazinti.
Robert April.
Yeah, Robert April. There was also a plan for Bjayzl in Stardust City Rag, the episode of Star Trek Picard, the sort of gangster woman who Seven of Nine ends up murdering in cold blood.
You bitter about that?
Righteous killing, not righteous killing. Who knows? You know, interesting choice for a Star Trek episode. The original plan for that character, according to Akiva Goldsman, was they wanted to make her a Cation. And but ultimately they decided it was too expensive because they were going to have to make her fully CG. She was going to be a Cation, and the bar was going to be, rather than sort of a more kind of traditional bar, it was going to be more of an aviary, in which the bar was in this aviary, and this Cation sort of mob boss, effectively, is what she was, would sort of, you know, eat the birds who lived in the aviary.
I wonder if perhaps the Cats movie also put them off of it, and the negative reaction that the CG in that film got, or well, it wasn't CG, but the method that they used there,
digital fur technology.
Yeah, that I mean, it was widely panned, and I think, you know, Eddie was like, "Ooh, we ain't gonna do that." So, are you a social watcher of Star Trek, or do you mostly watch it on your own?
Mostly on my own. My wife is a genre fan, but not a Star Trek fan, I would say. I mean, she enjoys Discovery very much, enjoyed the J.J. Abrams Kelvin timeline movies. But in terms of the older stuff, it doesn't really connect with her. So yes, Star Trek for me has always been quite a solitary experience. Didn't really have any friends growing up who were all that interested in it. I actually sort of grew apart from it in college for a while. I sort of think I sort of got to the point where, you know, sort of 18, 19, and you're like, oh, now it's time to set aside childish things and become an adult. And I guess I sort of considered it at the time to be a childish thing. And so I did kind of sort of set it to one side for a couple of years. And I was actually deeply unhappy for those 2 years. And when I was in my last year at university, I had to have some relatively minor surgery, but it put me out of commission in terms of not being up and around for about 2 months. And it was towards it was actually right after I had finished all my exams and stuff for university. It was the summer between graduating and actually coming out here to America for graduate school. That's how I ended up here in the first place. And I had so much time on my hands, and I had all these Star Trek DVDs sitting on my shelf, and I thought, well, time for a full rewatch.
Oh, absolutely.
And I started rewatching it, and I don't know, at that point it was like, oh, this is what has been missing from my life for the last nearly 3 years at this point. I've been trying so hard to be somebody I wasn't, you know, in that I'm not this person who's massively into Star Trek when actually I am. And that sort of was, I came to re-embrace the franchise in a fairly significant way. One of the first things I did when I got out here to America was took a hop, skip, and a jump over to the Las Vegas sector for Star Trek The Experience, which was closing like 3 weeks after I got there. But I thought, because I just moved to America, I was in DC, I sort of thought, you know, I'm the closest I'm ever going to be to being there, so I might as well make the trip. And that for me was a religious experience, is probably too strong of a term for it, but it was definitely, in some ways, it was a real sort of fulcrum point for my fandom, which had which at that point was like burning low embers. And then I went and visited The Experience and left there, you know, and it was roaring flames again. And it's been roaring flames now for 12 years since I have been there, and it doesn't show any signs of stopping soon. Through Twitter, I have met many more fans who I now consider personal friends and see at least once a year at STLV. We'll see if we get around to it this year with everything that's going on. But There, it's a very social experience. But yeah, in my regular everyday life, I'm something of a solitary Star Trek fan, and in some ways, that is why I am so active on social media, is because I do like that community. I mean, as much as it's a toxic hellhole of ridiculous people, my friends included.
Oh dear!
It is it is a nice way of finding community, and there's actually a huge amount of benefit and value to it.
Yeah, I think I feel that, because that's the same reason I started live tweeting all the episodes, is because I have no one to talk to about it around here. So every time I sit down to watch an episode, now I have to fire up Twitter and make a project out of it. And people tell me I'm wrong.
That's half the joy of it.
I know, it's great. So at what point did you start to become a blogger, either for TrekCore or just on your own, or how did that happen?
I started writing for TrekCore. I've been a contributor there now for 3 years, nearly 4, I guess. It's probably 2017. I had started... The TrekCore Twitter account had followed me because, I mean, if you don't already follow me, just excellent, high-quality Trek content on @AlexanderTPerry. So, I mean, everybody listening, you should really check it out. It's fabulous. I'm kidding. I guess
I was not. No,
I had been followed at some point by the TrekCore account, and I started DMing back and forth with the editor, and we met at STLV, I think, in 2017. And that was also when I met Jim Morehouse and Claire Little. And that sort of introduced me to you and sort of the the tricorder crew. And I've not regretted it for a single moment. And sort of, I had been going to STLV at that point since 2011. And for me was also a purely solitary experience. I'd gone 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16, more or less just by myself. I had pretty much kept to myself. I had gone to panels, pictures, had a fabulous, fabulous time, but ate alone, watched Star Trek in my room alone. And so 2017, I was there. I met the sort of TrekCore crew, and I guess the book reviewer had sort of stepped away from the site. And I thought to myself, yeah, sure, I could, this seems fun. Like it's an interesting way of doing something constructive with your fandom, right? Like there are lots of ways to express the things you love, and not all of them are healthy and not all of them are constructive. And, you can just sit there and rewatch it, or you can build models, or you can read books, or you can, write out episode lists and put Fs next to the ones you think are favorites, and even more Fs next to the ones you think are even more favorite. But I was at that point in my life where I was like, you know what? I would like to apply myself in a way. I've got all this energy. I've got all this creative energy. I've got all this interest. Why not sort of channel that into doing something that other people might find useful or interesting? And so I started writing the book reviews, and then Discovery came out, and I started doing the Canon Connections, which is a series of articles where if during an episode there's a reference to something that happened before in another episode, I'll go through and pick that kind of stuff out and write it all up. And then it graduated to doing some episode reviews for Discovery Season 2, product reviews, and doing, I did the write-ups that we did for the New York Comic-Con panels and some of the new stuff like that. I went up to the Star Trek tour the Christmas of 2018.
This is the thing in Ticonderoga.
That's the thing in Ticonderoga, yeah, the recreation of the original series sets. And they had William Shatner and they had Anson Mount. And Anson Mount, who it turns out had wrapped filming Discovery at 4 a.m. and then had gotten on a plane to go down to Ticonderoga, or I guess Burlington, Vermont, and then got driven down, was pretty much at the end of his time on the show, and B, really tired, and C, just kind of didn't care anymore about the NDAs that he had signed. So he let slip that there was going to be 14 episodes in season 2. Nobody knew that up until that point. As far as we were aware, it was just 13 episodes. He was like, yeah, they decided to make a 14 episode season because they just had too much story to tell. And I was like, I think that's newsy, and I think I'm the only person who knows this. So I had no cell service, and it was right at the end of the day too. So I had nothing else to do.
That is Ticonderoga right there.
I had absolutely no cell service, and I actually had to get. I brought a separate GPS because I was like, I think I'm going to be really stuck otherwise. But I didn't know how to use it, so I had to get one of the Star Trek tour employees to help me like figure out the address of my hotel, which was back in Burlington. And so I drove back, being like, I think I've got a scoop here. I think I've got a scoop, and I wrote it up, and it got published. And then all the sort of genre-esque, especially a lot of the rebloggers like comicbook.com and comic book resources, they all ran with it. Trek Movie ran with it too, scooped them on that. And it's fun. It's a fun way of, it's nice to be in the mix. I also find one of the reasons I do it, and actually the primary reason why I do my podcast, Weekly Trek, which is just weekly 40 minutes of Star Trek news, never longer than 40 minutes, but it's a lot of work every week to 40 minutes. As you know, editing takes a really long time, especially if you do it weekly, even if you're just doing 40 minutes. And part of the reason why I do it and I'm really passionate about doing it is because there is so much misinformation out there online. I call it Dominion propaganda.
25% different?
Yeah, 25% different. The licensees have pulled out. Alex Kurtzman's been fired for the 42nd time. Seth MacFarlane's going to buy Star Trek. There is so much just pure, unadulterated rubbish that's out there that it was really important for me as somebody who paid very close attention to what was actually going on to sort of stand up and be the one to point out what was actually true to the best of my knowledge and push back against some of the stuff that was not so true. And it's gotten even more insidious in some ways because it's not just the bad news anymore. There's a lot of rubbish good news out there right now. A lot of rubbish good news. Discovery's getting a 5th season and a feature film, right? And they're all saying that not only is it going to happen, but they've confirmed it's going to happen. And like, none of that is necessarily going to happen. LeVar Burton was interviewed by Entertainment Tonight just this past week, and he said that he had been in conversations with the producers of Star Trek Picard about a role in the 2nd season. To which I think it was Comic Book Resources.
Coming back, confirmed.
Yes. They didn't tweet it, they had this headline on their website which was Geordi confirmed for Picard season 2. No, he isn't. There's a long way between he says he's talked to them about it to it's actually going to happen. And sometimes they do get it right. Star Trek Picard Happening at All started as a British tabloid newspaper published that Patrick Stewart was in conversations about coming back to Star Trek. And I remember at the time going, that is pure rubbish. That will never, ever, ever happen. And 6 weeks later, he was on stage in Las Vegas saying, I'm coming back to Star Trek. One of these other, ridiculous sites posted that Brent Spiner would be reprising his role as Data in Star Trek Picard Season 1. And I remember saying at the time, that is rubbish. It's never going to happen. Of course, it happened. They are occasionally right, but it's so minimally... It's such a de minimis amount of being right that you have the 98% of being wrong that in most cases, you might as well just wait until the news is actually announced and then talk about it, rather than just get wrapped up in these worlds of whether it's the bad news world or the good news world of what's happening with the Star Trek franchise and is it successful or is it unsuccessful? Because apparently we're in a culture war about whether Star Trek is good or is successful or not. That
it seems like a religious discussion.
It is a religious discussion. It's so weird that the political discourse of our lives, where it's very much one side and the other side, and one side believes it all one way and the other side believes it all the other way. I mean, I know you're a true original, John, and don't necessarily conform to either
trying to
side.
butter me up here.
Either side of our current political dynamics, but take away labels like Democrat and Republican and just look at the dynamics that take place between two camps of people. And you see it playing out all over culture right now, including in the Star Trek realm, where you have a group of people who think and believe and feel one way very strongly, and you have a different group of people who think and believe a totally different way very strongly. They're both convinced they're 100% right about everything that's going on. They both have their own news sources that they get their news from, some of which you might say is more objective than others, but there's these two totally different information ecosystems, and there's just war in between the two. It's so
one of the things I find very amusing about the whole thing is that, to me anyway, one of the key messages of Star Trek is that you have more in common with the people that you think are unlike you than you think you do.
Yes.
And that's one of the key messages of all Star Trek, right? I mean, right back to the original show. But there are people out there and on all these sides who are like, absolutely not. I have nothing in common with those people and I hate them. And I think, whoa. Slow your roll there, Chief.
Right. Yeah.
It's fascinating to me. So you mentioned that you go to STLV, but I know that there's also a local convention to you in DC every year. I don't think it's necessarily Star Trek only, but it's more sci-fi in general. Do you go to that one and other conventions as well?
A little bit. Awesome Con is the one you're thinking about. It's the big sort of DC area Comic-Con. There's also another one sort of up in the Baltimore area called Shore Leave, which has been going on for donkey's years now, probably since the early 90s. Started out as a Star Trek convention. Now it's sort of a general sci-fi convention. I've been there 1 year. It's an odd experience. It's like going into a time warp and actually being at a Star Trek convention in like 1996, 1997. It's closest you'll ever come to living inside Trekkie's documentary. And so I do go to a few. STLV was my first, and I've been to 9 STLVs now consecutively every year since 2011. I went to one of the Creation Chicago shows while they were still doing Star Trek shows outside of Vegas. I also went to the one that they did in Cherry Hill. But other than that, yeah, I will go to Awesome Con if they have good Star Trek guests. I did go to Shore Leave 1 year. And, but I'm not like Marina Kravchuk, who goes to lots of conventions all across the country. I go to STLV. I might go to the occasional other one if it is either near or convenient. I'd really like to go to Destination Star Trek. This was going to be the big year where I was going to make a big push to go to Destination Star Trek. But unfortunately, I don't think that's as likely anymore with everything that's going on in the world right now.
Right.
But yeah, STLV's mostly been my home base.
So one of the things I've noticed when I talk to people about conventions is even people who go a lot, they tend to have different things they want to do. Are you one of those people that when you go to STLV, for instance, do you like to sit in that main theater and watch all the headliners all day? Or are you looking at the secondary theater or hanging out with other people doing your own thing? Or what's sort of rolled into that burrito of the convention going experience for you?
Yeah, so for me, it's a mix. I do like the main theater. I also like the secondary theater. I will probably be in either one or the other if there is a panel that interests me. And the panels that interest me are quite varied. I am happy to go and hear Terry Farrell do the Terry Farrell show for the 90th time, because there are some people who don't like hearing the actors tell the same stories all over again. But I rewatch the same episodes, over and over and over again. So, I'm just, it's my thing, right? You go once a year and you hear Terry Farrell tell the story about getting fired from Deep Space Nine, or George Takei opening a furniture store wearing his Voyage Home uniform. And so I like doing that. I like the secondary theater for a lot of the product related stuff. I'm a huge Star Trek books fan, and the book panel is normally in there. The big thing that I actually, though, sort of build my schedule around is the photo ops. For me, the picture...
Photo op guy.
Yeah, I'm a huge photo op guy. Not really autographs. I don't necessarily see the appeal of autographs. I will occasionally get a photo op signed if I have a good opportunity to do it, but I'm not the guy who's going to wait 4 hours in an autograph line for an autograph. But the photos, I love the photos. So my very first STLV in 2011, I was going and I was really enamored with the idea of getting pictures taken with the cast. And they had Patrick Stewart there that year. They had William Shatner, Kate Mulgrew, it was Leonard Nimoy's last STLV and his second to last convention appearance ever. And it was my first. And I came up with this thing in my mind where I had a yellow TOS shirt, which I'd gotten at Star Trek The Experience. I had a Voyager top and like the little sort of gray dicky undershirt. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Which I'd gotten for Star Trek The Experience because you could get your picture taken on the bridge of the Enterprise, and I wanted to do it in costume, and the Voyager one was the only one I could find on short enough notice. So I thought, all right, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be really strict with myself, and I'm going to say this seems really cool. I'm just going to get the captains. So I'm going to buy myself a photo op with Patrick Stewart, William Shatner, and Kate Mulgrew, because those are the three captains who are present. I've got 2 out of 3. Well, why not just get myself a Next Generation top and then, go get a picture with each captain wearing the appropriate uniform?
Oh, of course.
Yeah. So then Leonard Nimoy announced it was his last convention, and I said to myself, no, I'm being strict with myself. Of course, technically he was a captain in the movies, but I was like that I'm thinking about 5 captains, so 5 pictures overall. I said I'm not gonna break down and get this picture, so I didn't, and it sold out. I show up at my first SCLV, and probably within about 2 hours of being there, I had bought and done my first photo op that was not the big 3 with Tim Russ. And from that moment, I was like, I think I got 10 that convention. Unfortunately, not Leonard Nimoy, and there was never another opportunity to get a picture with him, which is very sad, which is probably my biggest convention regret, not having gone through with that. But so every year I'll probably do about 10 photo ops per convention, and I have kept up with my wearing the right costume of the show that actor was on. So it's not always, so it's normally just the captain's uniform of the show. That means that my Deep Space Nine collection, I have a mix of the red-shouldered uniform and the gray-shouldered uniform. The Enterprise ones, it's all the Enterprise jumpsuit. The original series motion feature films, it's the Monster Maroon. It has sometimes involved me walking out of the photo room, going into the bathroom, changing my costume, and then getting back in line because I had 2 that were stacked next to each other that were from different shows. It's been a long time since I've done that. I'm now at the point where I'm a bit choosy in that I won't buy them until I see the schedule, and then I will because a lot of these guys, they might not come back the next year, but in the time horizon that I've been there now, which is almost a decade, most people have come through 2 or 3 times. So I'm like, if it doesn't quite work out, I'll catch them next time.
So of the people that are still available to get photo ops with, what's the biggest get for you? The one that you are missing the most right now, that you feel like, man, I got to get that one when I can get it?
That's a great question. I'm pretty thin on the Kelvin timeline because most of the big Kelvin timelines crew went to STLV before I did. So Zachary Quinto was there the year before and never came back. John Cho was there the first year I went, and I didn't get him. So I missed out on those 2, even though they were available at some point, and I was sort of hoping they would come around again. But yeah, in terms of the main cast, I've actually got all of the main cast that do conventions for all of the shows and who are still with us. So that doesn't include people like Jolene Blaylock and Jennifer Lean, but they don't do conventions, so there's no opportunity to get pictures with them. Everybody else, though, I've been pretty fortunate that they have been there. I even have a picture with Avery Brooks, who retired from conventions one day, just decided he wasn't going to do it anymore. And I just happened to have been lucky that when I think it was STLV 2012 that he was there, and I jumped on the opportunity to get a picture with him. And, there are people now who, won't get that because he's not doing conventions anymore. So yeah, I've been pretty fortunate. I mean, Leonard Nimoy obviously is the one that I regret the most. Aaron Eisenberg, I managed to get a picture with him before he passed away. Rene Auberjonois, I have a couple of pictures with him before he passed away. Actually, the one that I remember thinking, oh, I want to do this and didn't, and then never got another chance was Barry Jenner, who played William Ross in Deep Space Nine.
Admiral Ross.
Admiral.
Yeah.
He was there doing great, and then unfortunately he passed away before the next year, where I was like, oh, they'll be here forever. I'll get that one next year. So yeah, I would really like. Oh, actually, no, there are a couple that I would really like. Christopher Lloyd, who's been a few times, and I think he was there at least once while I've been there too, and I've just never managed to get. I would love for Malcolm McDowell to go to one, who was Soren in Star Trek Generations, because for reasons we'll talk about, I really like that movie, and I think he's a great villain, actually.
I am not a photo op guy or an autograph guy at all, but when Kirstie Alley went to STLV, I bought myself that photo op.
Yep.
I had to have that. Because I remembered being, I think it was like, I might have been 12 when that movie came out, 11 or 12. And I just said to myself, oh man, Star Trek 2, I went and sat in the theater wide-eyed, and I remember the impression I had of Lieutenant Savick, and I just said, that's it. I got to get that photo up. There was no debate. And I never buy those things, but they got me.
That was an expensive year because that was 2016, and they had Kirstie Alley and Whoopi Goldberg.
Yes, indeed.
And Whoopi was a big get, and I'd lost a lot of weight that year because it was my wedding. So that is a great picture.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah. I gave it all back. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Well, I can tell you one thing, man. I mean, not to get off topic, but with this quarantine thing, I am turning into Fatty McFat Pants.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Oh my God, I am just eating nonstop. It's like I'm the Horta about to go into hibernation for 100 years. So you have a wide variety of Starfleet uniforms that you have, Alex. Do you cosplay anything besides Starfleet?
No, I'm not. When I am at the convention, I will pretty much 100% of the time be wearing a Starfleet uniform, but I am neither creative enough nor bold enough to go any further than that. So I don't do a particular character. It's just me in a Starfleet uniform, just sort of wandering around. And really the uniform that I'm wearing probably is connected with whatever the next picture I'm taking is. So if I'm wearing an Enterprise jumpsuit, there's a pretty good chance it's because I've got an Enterprise photo op coming up. Or if I'm wearing a Picard uniform, it's because there's a Star Trek Picard photo op coming up, like there was last STLV after they'd announced that folks like Frakes and Spiner and Jerry Ryan were coming back to the franchise. But no, I the one I would do if I had the inclination and the patience for it is I'd love to do a Judge Q.
Oh, right.
All Good Things, Encounter at Farpoint, like the big hat and the flowy red robes.
The big red robe, yeah. It's beautiful looking.
It is beautiful looking. I just, I'm not if something is available for me to purchase, I will purchase it. If it's not available to purchase, it sort of enters this realm of too difficult for me to even conceive of. Right. If it's not available from Ruby's, Anovos, or the Chinese cosplay tailors, then it's a little outside of my wheelhouse.
Gotcha. I gotcha. Now, the M5 tells me that you're in very big danger, Alex, of your apartment sinking into the swamp that is DC because it is overweight with eagle moss ships.
Yes.
So tell me about what's going on here. Do you have them all? Are you like Pokemon, got to catch them all? Or just your favorites? What are you doing? On a
percentage basis, it's probably 98%. I think there are a few that I decided not to. But yeah, most of them I do. They're in probably about 12 to 15 66-gallon plastic boxes full of just these ships. I think
so you don't take them out of the box?
Well, I do. I have a rotating there's 10 that I have out, and I'll rotate them around. So there's only 10 on display at any one time. They'll be there for a couple of months, and then I'll get bored of them, and I'll put them all back in the boxes, and I'll pull out 10 more and stick those out. The subscription line started, I want to say it was 2014, and I think I got a raise or a promotion, and my gift to myself that turned out to be a significant amount of both money and space was to start the was to start the original subscription, which was 2 ships a month for however long the collection lasted, and 6 years and 180 ships later, which was just the original line. Then you've got the specials and the XLs, and now the Discovery line, which has got 27.
You're buying all of those, the XLs and all that stuff?
Pretty much. Yeah, there's, as I say, there are the odd few that I have taken a pass on. Some of the concept ships I've not been terribly interested in when they go too far into the variant line. So like the Klingon Bird of Prey, I did not get the landed wings up version because I already had the wings straight, wings down version. I didn't think I needed a third with the wings up. But yeah, pretty much all the others I have gotten, and I don't see it ending anytime soon. And
so in addition to Eagle Moss ships, I understand that you're a book collector.
Yes, I have pretty much at this point, I think, most of the books ever published under the Star Trek license, whether that's nonfiction or fiction. So I know I have all the novels at this point, and I think I have most of the reference books. Some of them are a little harder to come by at this point. I got my first Star Trek novel. It must have been probably, it was for my birthday, so it would have been August 94, because it was the All Good Things novelization, and All Good Things was May of 94. And I was given this book, and I read it cover to cover, and I loved it. And then I discovered that there were more of them. And so then I started getting them and reading them. And eventually I decided, because I am one of those people who, once he starts off down a path, decides he has to have them all, like with the Eagle Moss ships, decided I had to have them all. And so starting in about 2010, at that point, I probably had about, by now I've probably got 800, 900 books in total.
Goodness.
At that point, I probably only had about 200. I started buying on eBay basically big lots of novels. You know, someone's selling 40 books, somebody else is selling 50 books. And so I probably got like 2 or 3 sets of those. And that got me pretty close to having all of the novels. And then I started filling in the little sections that I didn't have. One of my first purchases here in the US, piece of furniture for myself, was a bookcase so that I could put all my Star Trek books on them once I decided I was going to be here for a while, and it wasn't just going to be a 1-year graduate school thing after I got a job, and it was looking like I was going to be here for a bit longer than that. And I dragged it. I don't have a car because I live in the middle of the city. Never have had a car here in the US. And I bought it at a Target over in Columbia Heights, and then took it on a 30-minute metro ride. And the thing must have weighed 70 pounds, this bookshelf. You know, me just like struggling with it through the metro because I was so desperate to have somewhere to put my books on. That is how fastidious of a collector I am. And now I read them all because I also review them, but I really like the books. The books, particularly after Enterprise went off the air in 2005, were a really good way of keeping my interest in the franchise alive and giving me new stories and new content, right? Because between 2005 and 2017, we got 3 movies, and that was it. You know, in terms of like things you could go and watch that were new, it was the Kelvin Timeline movies and nothing else. But you got a new Star Trek story every single month. Every month for that whole period of time. And the books were doing things where, you know, once the shows had gone off the air, they sort of just decided, well, let's just take the last moment of the season finale or the last moment of the last movie, and let's just continue telling the story forward from there. And they actually did really interesting things. There are some great books about what happened after the end of the shows. Of course, you know, none of it's canon. We'll take all of that as read. It's never been canon. It never will be. It's also been largely contradicted by now what is established on-screen canon, but it doesn't make them less interesting or good stories. It just makes them different interpretations of the same events and different stories by, you know, with the same characters doing different things, but they're still the same characters that you loved, and they're still in interesting situations that are very Star Trek and doing lots of interesting things. And yeah, I'm a huge book fan and defender of non-canon Star Trek works, because there are so many fun stories you can tell, and they don't necessarily have to count in order to be good. And so, yeah, it was one of those things where I decided, for me, a lot of the collecting stuff is about, and we'll probably get on to talking about this in more detail once we get to the last thing that I know you're going to bring up. For me, it's about getting as close as I can to being there in two senses of the word. Being on the bridge of the USS Enterprise NCC 1701D in 2363 with the noise of the ship around you and swish swish and take the turbo lift down to main engineering, like being there in terms of actually being in that fictional world, a place you can never get to and in real life. And so you need to find other ways in, whether it's through books or through ship models or through going to Star Trek The Experience or going to Star Trek The Tour in Ticonderoga and walking the corridors of the Enterprise. That's one way of being close to the material.
I would imagine that, I get your point, but I would imagine that today, Alex, the books for you are more of a collector item, much like the models, because you can buy all the books on Kindle.
Sure.
So you physically want them. I mean, you have the Dead Tree books, right?
I do have the Dead Tree books. I actually it's weird. They say that boomers and Generation X are big ebook readers, but millennials prefer the Dead Tree, and I very much am a millennial in that respect. I can read a book on Kindle. I prefer to read a paper book. I don't know why. I respond so much better to a story when it's on the page than when it's on the screen. I've had to read a couple of the most recent releases on like PDFs on my iPad because with everything going on, Simon & Schuster's not been sending out review copies. They're like print copies. And that has been a thoroughly unsatisfying experience for me. But yeah, I mean, there is a collector's element too. You just want it because you have this collection and you're proud of this collection and it's your collection and it gets you close to that source material, whether it's being part of that sort of fictional world or whether it's standing on stage 18 in 1992 as someone yells action and the cameras are rolling and there's tape down on the floor for where people need to go stand and there's a prop guy over at the side sort of guarding the tricorders that have the blinky bits and somebody reviewing a copy of the script. Like, I want to both be in the 24th century and I want to be on stage 18 in 1992 while they're filming that same episode. And so for me, a lot of these collector's items do both. They both put me into the fictional world, but they also help put me into the real world at the time that it was and be there.
So I think you were hinting earlier at the fact that you have a collection of screen use props, and
yes,
this was probably going to come up. So first of all, why don't you tell us about your collection, what you have, and then tell us why it's important to you.
Yeah, so I've been collecting now for about a decade. I missed the big auctions that there were because I was in college and couldn't have afforded any of it if I wanted to. The Christie's auction and the It's a Wrap auction, where basically they took a warehouse at Paramount that had everything in it. Ship models, costumes, props, furniture pieces, and they just said, this is worth a lot of money, sell everything. And they sold everything. I mean, the little traveling exhibition that CBS has, that they have at STLV, the reason why it doesn't change every year is because that's all they have left. Like 10 costumes, a couple of ship models, a few props, and that's it. And a bunch of those, they don't tell anyone, actually come from the Experience. They're replicas. They weren't actually screen use props on the show. Because they sold all of that stuff. And it must have been in 2010. For some reason, it just sort of hit me that like, you could get this stuff. It's out there. It's accessible. If you do your homework, right? There's lots of people try and sell fake stuff, pass it off as real. If you do your homework and you are really careful about how much money you spend, you can get this stuff. So my first piece that I bought was an All Good Things Future Timeline comm badge. And I got this thing, and it's just this little, piece of resin.
Yeah.
And it was so There are no comm badges. There never will be comm badges. Certainly nothing that ever looks like that. And so the only comm badge that ever was and ever will be is a piece of resin about 3 inches tall that has a strip of Velcro on the back that they stuck onto another Velcro piece on a costume and hung there for however long the actor was on set. And I really like the small sort of badges. So I actually now have a quite extensive collection of comm badges and pins and patches. So I've got a lot of the Starfleets. I've got the motion picture Delta, the only color that there was on those costumes. I've got a couple of variations of those. The Epsilon 9 patch from the Epsilon 9 uniforms. I've got some of the rank insignia from the Monster Maroons. I think I have most of the enlisted ranks at this point, actually. I've got an ensign rank as well from the shoulder strap. Next Generation, Deep Space Nine Voyager, the Future Imperfect comm badge with like the 4 slats that went across the back.
The 4 horizontal lines, yeah.
That's right, and those were the ranks as well. The one I have is Beverly's. It's a commander rank, and it has Bev written on the back.
Nice.
My most recent addition was I got the Relativity comm badge from when you saw the 29th Century in Future's End in Voyager, and then in the episode Relativity. And I've got a bunch of the alien stuff. I've got some Klingons. I've got the Romulan badge from Nemesis. It's all in this big case where they're all displayed. Oh, I've got from Take Me Out to the Holosuite, I have the Niners and the Logician patches from the baseball uniforms.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. From the Mirror Universe, I've got the Klingon Cardassian Alliance pin. That's the one I obsess over the most. I do have regular props as well. So I have Type 2 phaser, Mark 10 tricorder, not the blinky kind, because those are way more expensive than I could ever afford, but the sort of static kind where, it flips open and it's got all the stickers on it, but it doesn't, there are no lights or anything like that.
Right.
I try not to get too many weapons, because Star Trek's not about weapons. So I've got the phaser, I've got a stunt Cardassian disruptor, it's made of rubber, the big kind of cobra looking thing. And I also have a Klingon duck tug, the most iconic sort of knife on the show. It's metal, which is great. It's one of the sort of hero pieces. The wing bits don't flip out. They only made 2 that did that. This one's fixed in place, but it's a really nice piece. But then I've got pads. I've got 2 or 3 pads. I've got Jim actually talked about this on the last episode of Trek Ranks, because they were talking about the Next Generation episode Disaster, when Geordi and Crusher get trapped in the cargo bay and they have to push all the cargo containers to the door, and then they get sucked out into space. So when they're pushing the cargo containers, they're these big industrial drums.
Sure.
When you've got the shot where they're all piled up against the door and the door opens and they all get sucked out into space, those are replicas that are about 6 inches tall.
Oh, perfect.
And they were all stacked on top of each other, and then they put string through all of them. So there's a little hole on the top of the bottom of each one. They put string through all of them. And then basically a guy just stood on the other side of the little set miniature they built and just pulled the string, and all the barrels kind of shoot out into space. Very simple effect. So I got a couple of those. Isolinear chips. I just got something that I've always wanted, is one of the big LCARS panels. So I just got one from Deep Space Nine, from from Tears of the Prophets.
Okay.
When there's a scene where they're in the wardroom and they're talking about it's a season 6 Deep Space Nine finale where they take the Chintaka system, and it's just after they've discovered that in the Chintaka system the Cardassians are building weapons platforms, and they have to get there before the weapons platforms go online. And there's this scene in which Sisko and Ross and Martok and the Romulan commander are all talking about how should they go now, should they not go now, and if we invade our Cardassian now, all we'll do is count our dead. And I've got the big LCARS that was on the screen, which is the planet orbiting the sun, and then there's this sort of web of around it, and that's the weapons platforms that are under construction. Before everything went to hell outside our lives at the moment, I'd commissioned someone to make a big light box so that I could mount it and then turn it on and have it lit from behind with exactly the same plexiglass that they had mounted these on. So that will be, once somebody in LA gets back to work on putting this thing together, that will be a very cool piece. That was something I'd really wanted for a while.
Is that the pride of your collection as we sit here today?
The pride of my collection is actually probably the pins and badges and patches that I put together over a decade, because I've had to get them from like all over.
Sure.
And it's been one or two every year, sort of added to the case, and it's now from all over. And there's some really obscure stuff in there, including Live Fast and Prosper, the Voyager episode where there are the 3 con men and they have the Starfleet badges, but they're like double the size of the actual Starfleet badges. Right. I have one of those. It's like double the size. My
favorite one, though, is the one where they have the clown in Voyager, and he comes out, he's got this big badge on that's like, it looks like it's like 8 inches high, and he's wearing it on his outfit. I just remembered seeing that in the episode for the first time, and I think I fell right out of my chair when I saw that. So you should send me pictures of all that stuff. And I will put it up on the show notes page over at Trek Profiles so people can go and check that out and enjoy some of that. What does it do for you, this collection?
I think for me, it's that fact of there never will be a tricorder. There never will be a comm badge. There's never going to be a isolinear chip. Like, those things only exist to the extent that there are props of them. And it goes back to that getting close to 2 separate worlds, the fictional world in the 2360s and the real world of the 1990s. And when you hold that piece of resin or rubber or plastic in your hands, you're in both worlds simultaneously. You're in the fictional future because you've got a tricorder in your hand, right? Nobody can tell you that's not a tricorder. That is the item that's in your hand. It's the same item that was in Captain Picard's hand when he was scanning for whatever he was scanning for. Mm-hmm. It's also the prop that was in Sir Patrick Stewart, or I guess Patrick Stewart at the time's hands when he was waving it around when there was no sound and just because somebody had told him to wave it around. And you've got those 2 worlds together at the same time in this, granted, extremely expensive thing that you have bought that you probably should have, saved on a down payment for a house for, but this was something that you wanted more. And it's there. And in that moment, you are the closest you will ever be to both being in that future world and being on that soundstage and being part of it. You can never get those experiences in real life. They just don't exist. You can't go back in time, nor can you go forward in time to a future that will never exist. And so for me, having those items is the strongest connection that I can ever have to the source material expressed in both of those different ways.
Well, Alex, I think it's time to move on and talk about some episodes. Are you game?
Let's do it.
So I think I want to start by talking about an episode that I consider to be one of the best of all Star Trek, and I was pleased to see that the M5 has selected it for us, and that is Voyager, the Omega Directive.
Yes. Voyager does religion.
There are some moments in this episode that really stick out to me, but I'm curious for you, Alex, what moments really stick out for you in this episode?
The thing that really sticks out for me in this episode is the conversation between Janeway and Tuvok on the planet when they found quite how many Omega molecules there are. And they basically have this conversation, and I forget the exact terms of it, but it's something like the final front. There are some frontiers we shouldn't cross. One of the core fundamental ideas of Star Trek is just go out and learn and learn and learn and learn and learn and learn, and there's no end to it. The more knowledge you get, the better it is. And what I really like about the Omega Directive is that it's one of the few episodes to challenge that precept of the franchise as a whole, that more knowledge is better, by taking this idea that there is a substance out there that is so appealing to you, but so dangerous that there is this really interesting debate in which nobody is wrong about whether you should pursue that knowledge or not. And Star Trek doesn't do this a lot, where they go, no, there are some things we just shouldn't know about, because they sort of reflect in many ways the late 20th century, right? Which has been one of more, push further, push harder, push into new frontiers of knowledge and industry and technology, because that's going to have all of these benefits that are going to stack up down the line. But we've seen at certain points along the way, maybe that's not the case. Maybe there are off-ramps where we should say, you know what, this isn't something we should push too much further on. The big thing that people are talking about right now in our world is artificial intelligence, and whether, you know, is it right just to keep pushing further on that, knowing that once you hit a certain threshold and past that threshold, you're into all kinds of different scenarios, you know, not like Terminator, but like, you know, all these people losing their jobs because AI has taken over, you know, a large amount of human industry that lots of people rely on for their livelihoods. That's why, so the Omega Directive, you know, it's probably not most people's top 20, top 30 episodes of Voyager, but I love episodes of Star Trek that challenge the fundamental notions of Star Trek themselves. And that'll be the theme, I think, for a lot of the episodes that the M5 will have selected. And this one challenges, and a lot of that is around politics, like challenging the politics of the future. But this one challenges the science of the future. And it says, is it right that you just constantly push further? And Janeway's perspective on it is no, we have to shut this down. And we need to unlearn this for these people who have learned this, and just get rid of it and pretend it never existed and move on with our lives. And Seven of Nine's perspective on it is the counter argument that knowledge for the sake of knowledge is a good thing. For her, there's this religious element that's tied into it as well, around her sort of search for God. The Omega Directive is Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, actually done well. But strip away the sort of quasi-religious elements to it. It is that argument about, no, we should go and know what this is and learn more about it, because it is good to have done so. And so I really like that sort of, that argument that the episode plays out. And it kind of doesn't tell you what the right answer is, because Janeway is right, because they come this close to averting a major disaster that would have crippled the Delta Quadrant and meant that Voyager could never have gotten home. But they also came this close to discovering something really profound about this amazingly fundamental molecule that holds all of this potential. And they're both just on the cusp of being right, and they're both just on the cusp of being wrong. That's why I think it's a really well done episode.
In one of the discussions I had about this episode, I think with our mutual friend Barry DeFord, was, for me, one of the moments of it that really got me was when Seven sees the fully harmonized molecule. And the only way I was able to describe it was a Saul of Tarsus moment. When it's one thing to have a faith in something, right? To believe that there's an objective you're working towards, even if you can't quite work it out. But it's another thing to see that made manifest in the real world, right? And it had such a deep impact on her, and you could see it right in the face of the character. It's probably one of my favorite moments, and that probably made it one of the best episodes of Star Trek, in my opinion, is because of the impact it had on the characters and how it had a real philosophical core to it, where the answer was not clear, as you said. One of the things that I think is always interesting about Star Trek is sometimes they put forth episodes where they're trying to give you a philosophical dilemma, and you talk to fans and it's like 70-30 in favor of however they came out with it, you know, and you're like, well, then you didn't do a good job, right? If the episode isn't going to cause a bar fight, then it's probably, you know, it probably didn't hit the mark. and that one did. And another part of it too, and I'm sorry I'm going off here, but one thing that I really enjoyed also is that it held true to something I had studied when I was in college. I ended up taking a poli-sci class, which wasn't anything I had majored in. I took it as a gen ed credit. And we'd studied bureaucracies. And one of the things that we learned is that every bureaucracy first exists to self-perpetuate itself, as any life form does, right? Regardless of anything else. And of course, the first thing the Federation does is to exist to keep the Federation going, regardless of citizens, regardless of rights, regardless of anything, right? And here's Starfleet saying, we got to stop this thing because it's a direct threat to the Federation, right? Not the people, because they would probably be okay.
Right. Right.
But it's about the Federation itself as a political entity being able to exert its power, right? And that struck me as very true,
right?
Which I really enjoyed as well.
Yeah, it's not gonna kill anyone. Well, I mean, wherever the sort of base explosion is, it'll kill people. But 10,000 light years away from there, it's not going to kill anybody, but it will fundamentally alter the political power structures in which they live, for sure.
Absolutely, which made it an existential threat, right? And that's why they had to control it with the Omega Directive and the computer screens going black and all that stuff. I just thought it was great.
Right.
All right, let's talk about a very different kind of episode. Let's talk about a twofer, Alex. Let's do Deep Space Nine Homefront / Paradise Lost. Here we have Sisko going back home, dealing with his dad in the restaurant, and we have the changelings, and we have Leia Brahms, Captain Benteen coming back. Very interesting set of episodes. And really weird in a way, and that we're taking Sisko out of his element and sending him back to Earth. Original Star Trek, TOS in particular, had a prohibition about going back to Earth. Mm-hmm. And even in TNG, they really didn't go back to Earth all that much. And when they did, it was in and out. It wasn't, they weren't there for very long. I mean, I think Conspiracy was probably it in very early on. And they were in and out and only made like one appearance in an office building, and that was it. So, very different sort of episodes in general. I'm curious as to why you picked it. I'm going to speculate that it has something to do with a political message. Am I wrong or am I right?
You are right. I am fascinated by Star Trek that, in the same way that we were talking about with the Omega Directive, challenges its own sort of laws of nature. Mm-hmm. And one of the laws of nature for Star Trek is that humanity has reached this utopia, that all the problems are solved. I mean, yes, in the original series, that was not the case. Gene Roddenberry's Wagon Train to the Stars had nothing to do with that. And then at some point between 1969 and 1987, and you see it kind of start playing out in like the motion picture novelizations where Roddenberry really starts exploring some of these ideas of future humans and figuring all their stuff out and being better, more evolved people. But by the time you get to 1990s Star Trek, that Roddenberry edict of no drama between the characters, humanity's got their stuff figured out, that we live in this evolved society and all of the drama and conflict must be external to our main characters, and by extension, and there's this massive debate about this, certainly in the context of modern Star Trek, and let's call it the Kurtzman era, of that also applying not just to the main characters on the ship that we're following, but also to other humans, to the Federation as a whole. Deep Space Nine was the very first Star Trek that really came along and challenged the idea of the utopia. And Homefront and Paradise Lost are these perfect examples of that, because you have lots of Starfleet officers who go through, in our world terms, exactly the same debate that we went through a decade later, or less than a decade later, where after 9/11, there was this huge debate all across society, freedom or security. In Roddenberry's kind of next generation vision, it's freedom always, because security is never a problem. That was his sort of next generation kind of philosophy, was we had gotten to the point where we had solved so many problems. You never got into those thorny political issues of at what point do governments have to start drawing lines to say, okay, we're going to infringe on this liberty for X result. And Homefront and Paradise Lost is a two-parter where you see the institutions. yes, there's a Badmiral, right? Admiral Layton, and there have been Badmirals and bad commissioners and bad ambassadors all throughout the franchise.
Sure.
But they're really lone rangers almost always. This was the first time where it was a movement of Starfleet officers who said, actually, in order to protect Utopia, we need to undermine it. And I'm fascinated by the Federation as a concept and enamored by it as an ideal. But I want to know that it's hard to maintain, because if we were to build that same thing in our world today, it would be really difficult to keep it alive in that way. It would take a lot of hard work and a lot of effort by lots of different people all of the time to never lose sight of the ball of what that ultimate goal is. And the Roddenberry ideal of the Federation just sort of existing and always being happy and always being content and never having to grapple with difficult political questions is one I find deeply uninteresting. The one where they manage to have that utopia in spite of continuing to have to grapple with some of these questions that we don't have the answers to today, but they have managed to figure it out, and to demonstrate that there is a line between where we are today and where we want to be in the future of Star Trek, and that you can see the connection points between the two. That's the Star Trek that I love, because it makes it more real. It makes the people more real, and it makes the characters that we loved all that much better. It's easy. I'm going to use it's easy to be a saint in paradise, right? That's the quote from Marquis Part 2. It is easy to be a saint in paradise. It's easy to be a paragon of man when nobody is challenging you. It's really difficult to continue to be that paragon when everyone is telling you you are wrong. And that's what's happening to Sisko in that episode. He is working in this Starfleet structure where everybody around him believes in what Layton is doing and is going along with it, whether they're part of the quote-unquote conspiracy or not. Even the president of the Federation is convinced that it's a good idea to impose martial law on Earth because of the changeling threat. And Sisko has to push back on that and make the case about why that is wrong. And it makes the character so much better because it's not easy. The easy thing to do would just be to shut up, yes, sir, do what the Admiral tells you to do. You've been given this amazing career opportunity. You're now head of Starfleet security on Earth, a massive step up from where you were before. You don't have to live on a broken down, janky old Cardassian space station anymore. Mm-hmm. Like most people in that environment would go, oh, this seems pretty great. Yes, sir. Thanks for the great opportunity. I totally understand where you're coming from. Let's do this. But Sisko is like, no, this is wrong. And ultimately sort of turns people back to his side. And you see the course correction of the Federation where they go, oh, we've made a huge mistake. We need to go back and fix this mistake, rather than just being, we are so high-minded and so far above it all that it would never enter our minds to make a mistake. That I find profoundly uninteresting.
Couple of thoughts on this, Alex. I'll be curious how you respond to it. Is that, first of all, I think even if we accept, the quote-unquote Gene's vision whole hog, I don't think that there's anything in that implicitly which says that it's a marathon versus a hamster wheel. In other words, it's not like, well, we've currently reached it, so therefore we've ratcheted up to this level, therefore we can never regress. I'm not sure that follows. And so it has to be maintained, right? Even if you were to have the society that gets to that level.
Sure.
Why not, right? Couldn't we have some fits and starts and some cases where things go back and go forward? And I think that was perfectly consistent. And I think that might have been what you were getting at there. But I've also had a different reaction, and this might be influenced a little bit also by the most recent season of Picard that we've just seen, which is that even if you go back to the original TOS, the Enterprise would come across these miners living these terrible existences on these terrible planets. Janus 6. Is it This Side of Paradise with Layla Kalomi and Spock.
Yes.
Where they, right? Where, like, why would people choose to leave paradise, quote unquote, paradise, utopian paradise, and go be settlers on these horrible hardscrabble planets where they have to eke out an existence and deal with things that are much further down Maslow's hierarchy of needs than when you're, living back in the glorious Federation with all the material comforts. It's very weird. Now, that was sort of my first thought, and that's been with me since TOS time. And then in this most recent season of Picard, we're seeing much more of life outside of the Federation, outside of Starfleet, than we've ever seen before. Because even when we've seen outside of Starfleet, we've seen it from our Starfleet character's perspective, right? When we think about, even in Deep Space Nine, there's Jake, right? But Jake is Ben Sisko's son, right? So it's all through the lens of these Starfleet characters. And so one of the things I've wondered about, and I don't have an answer here, but one of the things I've been wondering about is, given just what we see on the screen, and without worrying about all the extra stuff that we hear about outside where the creators are telling us what we're supposed to think about it or what they really meant, which is that, are we just looking at life through the 1%? When we're looking at the Starfleet characters and they're sort of talking about how great Starfleet is. I mean, I'm sure if you go talk to like the very wealthiest, they'll tell you life is great right here on Earth right now in 2020.
Yeah, no, I think to your first point, that is very well taken. There is a big difference between the show as depicted to us on screen versus the show as interpreted through 30 years worth of fan experience. And I think my criticism is less of what there is on the screen and more of the way that many fans have interpreted what they see. The reason why I think lots of fans have had big problems with the depiction of the Federation in Picard is because they see it as, no, this is this group of people who have got their problems figured out. They've always got it figured out. And for you to suggest that they ever went through a period of moral crisis or a period of stagnation is anathema to what my understanding of this franchise is. That, I think, is the Star Trek that I find wholly uninteresting, which is partially the legend of Gene's vision and partially the way that has sort of mythologized itself into this very, very strict interpretation of what Star Trek should be. I think for the show and the franchise as a whole, and for the universe in which we find ourselves in, I'm not sure I would necessarily go so far as to say that it only depicts the life of the 1%, but it certainly doesn't only depict the life of the 100%, right? Federation society has solved many of its problems for many of its people. The existence of replicators makes it really easy for a monetary-based economy to largely collapse in a positive way, right? Not in a negative way of there's too much scarcity, but in a positive way of now everybody has the things that they need in order to live, and therefore, they can go out and do that. But Star Trek has always been really clear that a replicator is a fabulous piece of technology. It's not rare, but it's not ubiquitous. It is not as available to you as the air that you breathe or the water that you drink. Somebody still has to build that. There's still resource constraints around how many of them there are, where they go, the energy requirements that there are in order to run them. And so even though you have this massively impactful piece of technology that has made life so much better for so many people, right? Let's assume that everybody on Earth lives an idyllic utopian existence where all of their basic needs are met. And then everything else that they go out and do, whether you believe that the Federation has money or not, and the depiction of Star Trek is wholly contradictory about whether money exists. There are episodes in which it does not and never has existed. There are episodes in which it very much does exist, and people are buying things with cash, like the Harry Kim caretaker scene. He is preparing to buy something off of Quark with money. Well, where did he get that from if there's not some form of currency? But Picard says to Lily in Star Trek First Contact, we've moved beyond money. There's no, so it's totally contradictory. Your opinion on money in the society aside, people's basic needs are met, but not for everybody. because you're right. In the original series, in the Next Generation, I mean, Tasha Yar was brought up on a planet on which there were rape gangs, right?
Humans.
And mass starvation,
Yeah,
right? Humans.
Yeah.
Right. Who lived in a terrible situation and she got out of it. You know, that's not like throw a few replicators down on the planet, you probably fix some problems, right? But for whatever reason, those replicators aren't there. There is strife, there is turmoil that's not being addressed, that's not being fixed. And so I think Star Trek's political philosophy has always been one, and they don't explore this in too much detail. Deep Space Nine's really the only place, where they go into it in a massive amount of detail. Picard, probably number 2, in terms of doing a bit more of this, of like, there's still problems to solve, right? There's still things to sort out. It's not just the aliens who don't have their stuff together. It is still, while let's say 80% of people in the Federation live a idyllic utopian existence, that still leaves 20% who are out on the margins, whether by choice or by design or by not their choice. The need to push further and take care of people and continue trying to solve your society's problems, that doesn't stop the further out into the galaxy you reach. In some cases, you're just pushing some of those problems further and further out. For the people at the core, in the center, it's like gentrification in a city. Neighborhoods get better, they get nicer, higher end, more expensive. But that doesn't mean that the people who lived in that neighborhood necessarily experience those benefits. They move out into a different part of the city, and other people move in who can afford that lifestyle. I'm not saying the Federation is a giant gentrifier, but they certainly are not easily managing to meet 100% of the population's needs at all time that they come into contact with. They frankly also must have some form of border control, right? Because otherwise, why wouldn't everybody who lives on Fesarius Prime or whatever that awful Orion syndicated controlled planet was in Deep Space Nine Season 6 just up and move to the Federation where they can have this idyllic existence? I mean, Star Trek it's not supposed to answer all those questions. It's just supposed to tell interesting stories. But if you do start to explore some of those underlying concepts behind the franchise and as a whole, you do start to uncover some really, I think, very interesting, fascinating dynamics that make the concepts as presented more relatably human by making them less perfect, by making it so that some of the issues and questions and problems that we're facing today in our everyday lives, they face a version of those problems and questions in their lives. Their lives might be a whole lot better than ours are, but there's still more to do. There's still, you haven't reached Fukuyama's end of history, right? That like early 90s notion that history was over and we were done. How laughably ridiculous is that idea now? But it's also sort of, that is presented in the far future of the 24th century as, from the Federation's perspective, sure, the Dominion might come along and the Borg might come along, but in terms of their own sort of, Federation, you're in a stasis. Everybody's happy. Everybody's fine. It's all going good. I like this idea that it can be difficult and it can be hard, because by being hard, that makes it worth having. If it was just easy for these people to do these things, Michael Chabon has talked far more eloquently about this than I have, in which he compares the Roddenberry Legend Federation, right? Everybody's figured out their problems. There are never any problems. To Lothlorien from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Yep. This magical land of elves where everybody is happy and lives forever all of the time. And he says, and he makes this case, that's not interesting, right? It's an interesting place to go, to walk around, to kind of hang out in. But from a human perspective, that doesn't tell you anything about yourself. That tells you something about an ideal that you can never grasp onto because you are human. Because by virtue of being human, there are bad things about us, and we'll never quite iron all of those issues out. We'll always have to grapple with them, and we'll always have to struggle to be our better selves. And Star Trek should be struggling to be its better self as well. Otherwise, we might as well be watching a show about elves.
It's a direction, not a destination.
Precisely.
I feel like I want to amplify something I said earlier, because I'm thinking in retrospect, and the way I asked the question, I think the words might have been ill-chosen. I don't know, but I just want to restate this before people come and talk to me about it on Twitter, which is that I said before, perhaps we're looking at the 1%, and I don't mean that in terms of economics, but what I'm thinking of is in the early seasons of TNG, we see Wesley trying to go to the academy. And one of the things that we see in episode after episode is what an ordeal it was, that he had to pass exams and another exam and then a psychological test and then another exam and then recommendations from all these different people. And so one of the things I wonder about is, well, these people are not a cross-section of society. Mm-hmm. These clearly have to be, whenever you're looking at Starfleet people in general, these have to be sort of the smartest, the brightest, the most well-adjusted, the people that have had a lot of intellectual capital and social development poured into them to be able to pass this exclusive test to get into this limited resource, this limited experience called Starfleet Academy. And so one of the things I think about just as myself, which is that if you're looking at the 430 people on board the Enterprise and TOS, or the people on Deep Space Nine, or whatever Starfleet characters you want to look at, that's not representative of Federation society, and it cannot be, even if you take the show on its own terms. These are people that are self-selected into that group, who are clearly at the top strata of the society, even if they would say that they're not. There's no other way that it could be, given what we're shown in the show. It's just not the case.
Right.
So that's what I meant by that. I wasn't trying to make an economic model. I'm not saying you you misunderstood my question, Alex. I'm just realizing as I said this, and as people listening to this might wonder what I meant by that. So I just wanted to amplify it a little bit there.
The best analogy, I think, is if you looked at modern day humanity based on astronauts in the space program.
Sure.
Right? A small collection of massively elite people. They're all extremely athletic. They all have valedictorian military careers, and most of them have PhDs. You know, if you just spent all of your time watching people who are NASA astronauts, you would have a far more generous view of humanity as a whole than by looking at actually humanity as a whole, right? Like, you and I are never going to be astronauts, you know, because we don't...
Speak for yourself.
we don't match up in some way, right?
Yeah.
We probably wouldn't be Starfleet captains in the 24th century. We would be doing jobs that probably are analogous to what we're doing right now. And Star Trek, just with the exception of Picard, is much less interested in spending time with those people. But I think it'd be interesting to do some more exploration of Federation society outside of Starfleet.
So since we've been talking about Picard, I think we should continue with that. And let's talk about a particular episode. I'm looking at the console here, and Remembrance, Picard Season 1, Episode 1, has come to the top of the list right now, Alex. So do you think that this is one of the best episodes of Star Trek, or one that's personally meaningful to you, or both?
It's personally meaningful to me. I don't think the episode has been around long enough for me to make a statement about whether it's one of the best of Star Trek or not, because I think episodes need time to sit and be part of a whole, and for people to get comfortable with them and watch them as many times as they've seen the other ones. We talked about religious experiences earlier with the Omega Directive. It was something of a religious experience for me to get Picard back on the air. I was much more deeply invested in the premiere of Picard than I was in the premiere of Discovery. And I was very invested in the premiere of Discovery because my very first experience of Star Trek was a Captain Picard speech at the end of an episode that defeated quote-unquote enemy, Max Frewer, with logic, not brawn. And that has structured my whole experience over the 20-some years that have come after that. And so to get that character back on screen was just an incredibly meaningful experience for me, to wake up at 3 a.m. on January the 23rd, load up CBS All Access and watch that episode. I watched it 9 times over the course of the first 24 hours that it was out. Yeah. I watched the Discovery premiere 7 times in the first 48 hours that it was out. So that kind of that's the comparison that you're working with on my scale of insanity.
There's no shame here on that, Alex. This is, I mean, anybody who's going to listen to this, I mean, you are in the audience of people who would be right there with you, right? You are among friends here, so that is A-okay.
Fair enough. But I really liked Picard season 1. I thought that the execution did not quite live up to the promise, but it was also going to be nearly impossible for that to be the case. I massively enjoyed the season. I thought it told a really interesting story, but it was challenging, right? The show was designed to challenge many of your fundamental conceptions about what Star Trek is and should be. And we've talked a lot about that, but it was also designed to challenge your fundamental conceptions of who Jean-Luc Picard is and was. Because and this is sort of a microcosm of the Federation debate. He is an Adonis. Many people consider him to be physically an Adonis, but I think most people would consider him to be a personification of perhaps more the ideal of an Adonis. He is a very sexy man. But he is supposed to be the, pinnacle of the perfect human, right? Take Roddenberry at his most proselytizing around the future and what his opinion of it should be, and no conflict between characters. Picard was the figurehead character for being that way. The perfect warrior monk type, thoughtful commander, always on top of his game, never gets knocked down a peg. Even when he's told there are 5 lights and there are only 4, he still manages to maintain his dignity. Perfect man. And in many ways, as a result, that's why he's many people's favorite character, because he is everything that we aspire to be. And that is made better, in my opinion, by them deciding to turn all of that on its head and show you a man who, since the last time you saw him, has gone through a massive amount of challenge, and he actually finds himself in a difficult place. Now, whether you attribute many of his actions over the course of season 1 of Picard to the Irumodic syndrome that they never call Irumodic syndrome, or just the consequences of his actions kind of catching up with him, and I think we won't know that until we see what kind of Picard comes back in season 2. Is he more of a confident figure, more of the sort of original Picard, or does he kind of sit in the same vein of the season 1 Picard? Jury's still out on that. But regardless of that, to see him go through a difficult period and have to claw his way out of the darkness into the light to sort of reclaim who he was, makes the character more human, because that's relatable to our lives and the things that we go through and the things that we do, right? There are periods of our life where we go, yes, we're riding high, we're making all the right choices, we're doing all the right things, we feel good about ourselves, high on our principles, high on our morals, and then there are periods of time where we feel like failures, where we have made mistakes. Maybe we've said something to somebody we wish we could take back, or we have ended a relationship that we regret having ended. Lover, family member, you name it. We all make mistakes, and so to discover that even the best of us is capable of making mistakes and then has to go through a period of rebuilding their life back to that ideal that we knew them for. I know lots of people don't necessarily want that because this is fiction, and fiction should just give you what you want, right? If you want Captain Picard to be a Superman, just have that, right? And keep having that. And frankly, that's kind of what the Orville is, right? It's like, people like 1990 Star Trek, so we're just going to give them more of it. And lots of people like that.
Yep.
For me, I find it much more interesting to go further, to push further. When you've got 800 hours that already exist, why not take 10 hours and go off and do something a bit more challenging and that will make you think and might not sit with you amazingly, to start off with, but that you will develop a profound appreciation for. And I think Remembrance very capably started a story that even though by the end of it Picard was less human than he was when he started, actually made him considerably less human than when he started, actually made him more human overall.
Well, it's an old story, right? That we get these characters who, and this isn't Star Trek, this is just in the world, right? How many stories in fiction have there been of the person who experiences another culture and then quote unquote goes native, right? And becomes one of them, right? It's a perfect example of that. And I just want to say, I personally was much more invested in Picard than I was in Discovery. The Discovery series just didn't really click for me, and I just wasn't interested in the stories that they were trying to tell. And I don't know. I think when the story is told after 20 years, I think some of the chaos that we all know occurred before the show went on the air couldn't help but manifest in what we ended up getting there. I don't know. But I was very interested in that story of like a real human who was so used to winning that when he didn't win this one, when it really mattered, destroyed him.
Right.
And I can't wait to see where it goes. So I'm pretty thrilled with it too. And I can't wait to see what happens. But I want to move on and talk about a very different kind of experience, Alex. I always like it when people pick things which are not necessarily the standard things that we see on TV for Star Trek or in the movie theater. And one of the things that you picked was the novel Control.
Yes.
Which was certainly interesting. I had not read it, and I read it for this, and I even live tweeted my thoughts as I was going through it. I don't know if you had a chance to look at that or not.
I did. I very much enjoyed the live tweet.
So, thank you. Thank you. So, certainly a very different style of book. Here we have Dr. Bashir, and in the book, the whole idea is that he is trying to stop the Control AI, which was called Uri or Uri?
Yeah, Uri, I think, something like that.
Yeah, that's its actual name.
Right.
But it's referred to as Control. And he's trying to stop it. And the whole book is about him teaming up with Data and Lal, which is glorious and beautiful, to go ahead and stop it. And at the end of the book, we're going to spoil this here, he basically ends up a kind of a vegetable.
Yes.
It's really quite stunning and sad, and obviously not consistent, I think, with what we've seen as far as canon from shows that have come out since. But I was very surprised to see that it's a very recent book. I thought this was
2016.
Yeah, I thought this was like a 1997 book or something. So I was quite surprised to see that it's very recently published. So I'm curious as to how this came to be on the list and what about it appeals to you, Alex, because it certainly was a very a walk through a scary and dark place.
No other Star Trek work, whether on screen or written down, has shaken me as much as that book did. No other piece of Star Trek fiction, again, on screen or off, has ever stuck with me the way that story has. So, again, we'll just... In order to explain it, I have to fully spoil it, so I'm just going to do it.
We already did. We already said it ends up as Bashir being a vegetable. So,
well, the fundamental... So Discovery did a version of this story in which Section 31 was run by an artificial intelligence called Control. And what the Discovery writers' room did was entirely strip that idea of everything that made it interesting. Control in Discovery was just a boring AI villain that you have seen 1,000 times over.
Right, mustache twirling villain, literally
that. Control in the book Control is an artificial intelligence that actually was developed in the earliest days of Starfleet. Go back to like the 2150s, right?
Before the Federation.
Right. Jonathan Archer's ready to go off out into the world, and they have designed an artificial intelligence that's not designed to be the head of a secret society police organization, an AI that is designed to help make life better for people. That's its role, its job, its overriding conceit is just make things better. And so they start putting this code in everything around them. And this AI develops its own awareness and its own interpretation of its job. Mm-hmm. And its interpretation of its job is that in order to make things better for people, it has to do several things. One, it has to help eliminate threats to those people before they start. And that's where the sort of Deep Space Nine-y Section 31 element comes up of, we do the dirty work that the Federation will never do to dirty itself. The other thing that it does is it makes the Federation happen. The artificial intelligence moves the pieces on the board in such a way that everybody gets together and they go, you know what, guys, we really need to get together and create a Federation. And that is so fundamentally undermining of the whole idea of what Star Trek is and could be, right? Our understanding of what Star Trek is and could be is that people did this, that it was hard and it was difficult, but we ultimately made the right choice. And that choice was to put division aside and to apply ourselves towards fellowship and cooperation and building something that mattered, that put differences aside. And what this novel says is none of that was true. That it was an artificial intelligence that made people believe they had freedom of choice, but really it controlled the political scenarios and circumstances. It killed the right people at the right time, and it put the right people in.
Including Federation citizens who had committed no crimes, but who merely disagreed with certain political thoughts. And the AI said, nope, this person has to die.
Correct. Because if they don't die, the Federation never happens, and the Federation has to happen. And I have to be the one, the AI has to be the one to guard this thing, because if they did it by the... And the book basically ends on this question, which the characters who discover the existence of this computer program that nobody knew existed, and Section 31, the computer program, become public, and there's all this fallout that happens.
Even the members of Section 31 don't know this.
Exactly.
Even the people at the highest levels of Section 31 don't necessarily know all this, which is the really amazing part to me.
Right. So the book ends with this question, which is, were it not for the computer program, would the Federation ever have existed? And I think the book is telling you no. And I asked, so I had the opportunity to talk to the author, David Mack, at one of the STLVs. He was there doing a signing. And I went and got my book signed, and I told him how much, it just shook me to my core. And I asked him, you asked this question, would it have happened were it not for this computer program? What's your answer? And he basically told me that he was in a bad place in his life when he wrote this novel. He was just really angry at a bunch of stuff and just sort of poured all of his anger and despair at people into this book, in which he totally pulls the rug out from under you of everything you thought you knew about Star Trek. And the book is massively divisive as a result.
Oh yeah. Oh, no question. I mean,
and I hate the idea of what it's telling me, but it's a really great action story. I mean, it's a propulsive thriller, that grips you and holds you all the way through 300 pages. It's a very well-told story, but the idea behind it is so awful, but so interesting that I can't let it go. And when Discovery, when it was Control, I was are they really going to go there? Are they really going to do this? But they didn't commit to it. They did not follow through. Following through would have been telling a story about this artificial intelligence and making those characters ask themselves the same question about, would we be here were it not for this control or not? What Discovery did was just said, oh, this is a cool idea. Let's just make it a mustache-twirling villain. And I enjoyed Discovery Season 2. I like Discovery as a whole. This is not a Discovery bash. What it is, though, is saying that there was just this so interesting, so challenging idea, and they just chickened out on it, because it would have been so interesting to have that as part of the canon and something that we could talk about and really, obviously the book exists, so we could talk about it. We're talking about it right now, but to have more, only a small subsection of people actually read the books, to have had it on the screen and for all of us to have talked about it would have been massively divisive and awful, but so much fun.
If you think that people went off the rails because the Federation wouldn't mount a rescue operation to save the Romulans, the very idea that the Federation is an iron-fisted, panopticon, totalitarian, absolute surveillance society that murders without any hesitation anyone who even it gives a squeak of opposition to the dominant ideology, and that's what the Federation is based and built upon from its core. I mean, if that was in canon, I think people's heads would have self-destructed. And I got to admit, I mean, in my personal life, I don't get into politics too much here, but I am very strong on civil liberties. And as I'm reading this, I mean, I had a very negative reaction to it. I may not have put all that on Twitter. I don't actually remember, but I was like, this is the most perverse thing I think I've ever read, right?
Extremely.
Yeah. I mean, people want to think the Federation is a utopia. It's a utopia because it is based on iron-fisted control and murder.
Yes. Yes.
Which, that's hardcore.
It is. The Star Trek that I really enjoy is one that challenges what Star Trek is, and ultimately at the end of it decides, actually, it's all good. We were right? Control I really enjoy because it sort of leaves it on a big question mark. And it is the most extreme version I think you can come up with.
Oh, yeah.
of taking Star Trek and saying, actually, it's not what you think it was. And it still sits with me. I still sit there and think about it. And there's been no other piece of Star Trek fiction that has really made me think about it as much as that book did.
I have to admit, as I was reading it, because I read it because you had selected it, I'm sitting there reading the book, and half of my brain was going, "Why the heck did he pick this?" I literally couldn't. I was like, "Is he having me on? I mean, what's going on here?" Because it really is perverse. It's beautifully perverse.
And I told you when you were on my show and we were talking about us doing this, and you were about to read the book. I said I'm not going to tell you anything about the book. But I said, I'm fascinated to hear what your reaction is. I'm not going to say you're going to enjoy it, and I'm not going to say you're going to dislike it. I'm just really interested to hear how you react to it. And that's how I feel about anybody reading it, because it is really well written, and it's really challenging. And if it were just bad and tried to challenge you but did it in a bad way, you would easily just sweep it off the table and go, that was a rubbish book and I'm not going to think about it anymore. But the fact that it did it in a really, it's sort of a thriller, the plot builds over and the sort of horror of it unfolds over the course of the story. It grips you and it doesn't let go, and then it just leaves you with all these questions at the end. And I think that is like elite level. If you really like to think about your Star Trek and think about what Star Trek means and what it is and what it should be, Control is like the final boss. If you can get past that book and out the other side and still feel good about it, you're in the elite club of like deep thinkers about, the Federation and 24th century man and the meaning of humanity and all that.
Oh, I'm right there with you, Alex, because that's come up on the show before, and one of the questions I often struggle with is the Federation as depicted in Star Trek a place where I would wish to live?
Yep.
And many times I come to the answer, no, it is not. It does not seem to me to be a place where the full diversity of humanity is allowed to flourish. It seems to me that a lot of people are quite flat. That there doesn't seem to be that eudaimonia, that human flourishing of people doing different things and living in different ways. And what John Stuart Mill talked about, experiments in living, which was essential for discovering true human happiness, right? Those things don't seem to be happening in a lot of ways. And as opposed, it seems to be like a 1950s, mom and pop show in some weird way. And it's always interesting to talk about. But I want to compare this Control story against another set of episodes on the list. We have to talk about the United Federation of Planets trilogy from Enterprise.
Yes.
Babel 1, United, and the Anar, which, by the way, I want to just preface this by saying I was watching this in preparation for this, and this is the first time my son actually sat down and watched Star Trek with me.
Oh, yay.
So it was to watch this trilogy of episodes, and he had all kinds of questions. Who are these people? Where are they going? What are they doing? What's happening here? And who's that guy? And, and all this. And hilariously, I don't know if you saw this, I tweeted it. He said, "Oh, this looks much newer than the old Star Trek you used to watch." And I said, "Well, yeah, it's a later thing." He's like, "So these are like those Star Trek movies you hate?" And I was like, "Oh, God, the Star Wars movies you hate?" And I was like, "No, I can't go down this road." But anyway, with all that's an awful lot of wind up for a pretty shallow pitch here, Alex. But you told me in particular that United was a big episode for you.
Yeah.
And given what we've just talked about with Control.
Yeah.
where there's sort of this darkness and sort of this iron-fisted sort of totalitarian flavor at the center of that book, versus United, which has this wonderful, beautiful optimism. Both of these things ended up on the list, so I'm trying to reconcile what's going on here, so you got to help me out.
Because they stand so far, because they are the polar opposites, Control is like undermining everything you thought you knew and wanted to know about this franchise. Let's just call it the Federation trilogy, is everything you wanted about the franchise and you wanted to know about it, right? Where Control is, you never figured it out, something else figured it out for you. The Federation trilogy is you watching them figure it out in real time. After 3 seasons of, the Vulcans are mean and the Andorians are mean and the Tellarites are mean and nobody's getting along, but maybe they should get along. And, the episodes that dealt with those Federation founder species were sort of set up with, they're going to come into conflict with each other. And then by the end of the episode, they're going to go, like maybe it is a good idea that actually we not do this and we do something different. But they never took you the whole way there. This 3 episodes takes you the whole way there. It takes you to that place of, you have the Vulcans and the Tellarites and the Andorians and the humans all working together and realizing it's in their best interest to work together, and they are stronger when they're together, and figuring it out in real time, and it being really difficult. And the Romulans were not just like, here is this enemy that's going to invade you and destroy you. Mm-hmm. It was not as cut and dry it was not as easy as that for them to figure it out. What the Romulans were doing was trying to stoke those divisions between the different races. And so not only did they learn to work together, they learned to work together in spite of somebody actively trying to poke their worst natures and bring their worst natures to reality. And they still managed to overcome it. And it's a great trio of episodes. It does lots of things. There's Romulans and there's Andorians and there's the Aenon in the last episode. There's a lot of stuff over the 3 episodes. And I think because there's a lot of stuff, for a lot of people, it doesn't rate as highly as, let's say, the Vulcan trilogy that came right before it, which is very tightly focused on this experience that the characters are having on Vulcan. But for me, this is what Star Trek is, right? You're seeing it happen. You're no longer just being told at some point in the past, an indeterminate number of years ago, we figured it out. And the adventures you're seeing now are a century removed from that, where we have figured it out. And this is just normal life for us. Like, this is the moment where they all sat across the table and they went, all right, let's do this. And that for me is hugely triumphal. To see that and to experience that, and for them to have, granted, it's not the moment where they all sit down and say, all right, let's sign the charter for the United Federation of Planets. You only get a hint of that in These Are the Voyages, where Riker and Troy are having that conversation and you're just seeing things happen down on the bottom. But this is the moment when the Federation was created, even though nobody said the word. And that is awesome. And it's so cool to see it. And again, it's well done, because even though it's the first thing, because it comes at the end, well, we know it's not the end anymore, but for a while it was the end of Star Trek, it means so much more from having done everything that came before to then go back and see that beginning than it does to see the beginning and then see everything that came after. I love these episodes because they are that hopeful and optimistic. We can and we did figure it out. Even under the most challenging and difficult of circumstances, we made those affirmative choices to listen to our better natures, and it massively paid off in our favor. Love these episodes.
Then why is TOS A Taste of Armageddon on the list, Alex? It seems to be in direct conflict to some of the stuff you just talked about.
I like this one a lot because it is one of the most... It's not the best episode. It's certainly not the best episode on the list. It's nowhere near the best episode of TOS. It was one of the first episodes I watched where I was like, oh, I get what they're trying to do with this show. I see it. I see that they've taken this idea war sucks. And they have come up with this way of entirely stripping back all of the sort of pretense that we have about, what that is, and just showing you in the most absurd terms possible why war is dumb, which is these two planets have decided they don't want to go through all the trouble of actually throwing bombs at each other, so they let the computers do it, and then based on how much damage the computers decide is done, they tell people they then have to go and commit suicide, and that's it. They just walk into a disintegration booth and they're gone. Again, not the best episode, but in my mind, one of those first episodes that really very starkly, but in a very interesting way, laid out some of the political themes that Star Trek itself was trying to explore. I think ultimately in a more interesting way. I know an episode that's come up on the show a fair amount, not least because you do a fabulous cosplay of it, is Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. Which lots of people, you hear that Majel Barrett quote a lot, because it's in Trekkies, about, you take Frank Gershwin, you paint him half black and half white, and then you take the other and you paint him half white and half black, and it shows that racism sucks. And sure it does, but it's really obvious, right? And it's a very ham-handed political message. A Taste of Armageddon is also kind of ham-handed.
I like the ham.
And I love the ham too. Give me ham all day long. It's one of my favorite meats. But Taste of Armageddon is one of those ones where it's it's actually a really interesting sci-fi concept to go along with it as well. That you can just focus on the sci-fi of it. How weird that this computer decides and then you just go and kill yourself if your time is up. But you don't have to do that. And then by the end of the episode, all of that is laid bare. I mean, there's a ton of problematic elements about this episode, like Kirk even suggesting wiping out the planet, even though he ultimately never follows through with it. But for me, it's one of the earliest episodes where I'm like, I think I get what this franchise is trying to do, which is tell you good stories, sometimes not great stories, but they're all supposed to be good stories. And do it in an interesting way that has an interesting twist to it. And so this is one of my favorite sort of sci-fi conceit episodes, particularly for the original series.
It's one of mine too. And one of the things about TOS that I'm always aware of when I watch it is that given the time, place, and manner in which it was made, many of the people who worked on the show, including Gene himself, were veterans who had been involved in war and seen World War II and Korea up close and had personal experience with it. And I don't know how many people are veterans working on the current incarnations of the show. I would have no way of knowing that. But I know that in TOS it was very clear. So in my mind, it gives sort of a moral authority to the episode when they say this, because they're in a place to know, quote unquote, in italics, underlined in bold. If you read about such things, or even if you make a serious academic study about it, you're not necessarily in the same moral place to make those statements. And that's not to say that they're unimportant or irrelevant, but it's to say that when someone that has had those experiences says to you, this thing is true because I've seen it, and this is memoir. This is not an academic distillation or a survey of literature. It has kind of a weight to it. And so when I see episodes like that, Patterns of Force is another example, which when you look at it, and you don't really aren't aware of sort of who these people are who write these shows, it might land a little differently. But for me, it makes it an even richer meal and even more satisfying.
The writers' rooms for Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager pumped out a lot of great content, but, and this plays out in a few different ways. The way you talked about is the most profound way of many of them just didn't have the life experiences to really understand some of the things that they were commenting on. It also plays out in the sillier ways about, largely it was a group of 20-something men who didn't have, let's say, a lot of relationship experience under their belt. So you get relationships that play out like, O'Brien and Keiko in Wounded, where they're married and she doesn't know what he eats for breakfast. Like, what married people look at that and see themselves in it, right? It's very much like,
it was very clear there were no other people involved in writing that.
Right. And that's very clearly a 23-year-old man's view of what marriage is like. But I think that's very true. And in some ways, the original series can be a richer experience for that, because many of the writers were older, had seen more in their lives, had experienced more, and were able to tell stories that in some cases were certainly more profound. I mean, they also told stories that were Spock's brain. So, nobody's perfect. And in The Next Generation, they told stories like The Inner Light and touch something that many of them, had not themselves experienced. But yeah, there definitely is something to be said for having some life experience under your belt.
One thing I will simply say is that Spock's Brain is a perfectly fine episode of Star Trek, and if you don't like it, you're an enemy of joy. Okay.
It's a joyful episode.
Alex, I'm going to seize up. I need to lubricate my brain and get a cocktail in me, because I am trying to understand why Star Trek Generations is on this list. Please talk me down off the ledge and tell me that you were having me on.
Okay, so it's a flashback all the way to the beginning of the episode, and we talked about how Star Trek is a very personal experience, and you experience it your own way, and the things that resonate with you may uniquely resonate with you. Star Trek Generations is that for me. It is not the best Star Trek movie. It is my favorite Star Trek movie. It is the one that if I'm going to watch a Star Trek movie, I'm going to rewatch Generations. I watched it just last night, not in preparation for this recording, 'cause actually I forgot I put it on the list, but because I was in the mood for comfort television, and it's just one of my go-tos. It was the first Star Trek movie that I watched and got excited about. It came out, I had the opportunity to see it while we were living in Saudi Arabia in 96. It came out on one of the TV channels out there. And every week we would get the TV listings for the 10 channels that we lived on this sort of compound of international Westerners, basically. And it had its own TV system. And so you would get your own version of the TV guide. And when I found out that Star Trek Generations was going to be on 3 weeks from now, I was so excited. A Star Trek movie, at that point, and a Next Generation movie, which was my show, because that was the one that, was on and popular, and, I was young and very much resonated with me. And I've always loved that movie because it was my first experience. But there are things about that movie that are actually good. And I think in the same way that we were talking about A Taste of Armageddon, an episode that probably, it's not in anybody's top 10. It may not be in anybody's top 20, maybe even not top 30 of TOS episodes for a lot of people. But there's stuff about it that's still really interesting and really good. There's stuff about Generations that's really interesting and really good. Like, for example, the Enterprise D never looked better than it did in that movie. The way they lit the sets, partially because they had to, because after 7 years, they were looking a little rough around the edges. And so they needed to come up with interesting ways to light the sets that would hide all of the scuff marks from 7 years of standard definition television production.
Right.
But the sets never looked better. The ship never looked better. The whole sequence, I mean, granted that all the plot holes around a 40-year-old Klingon bird of prey managing to take out the Federation flagship will take as read. But once that battle starts to play out through when the Enterprise crash lands on the planet. I have to
say, it also happened in Rascals.
It did happen. Yes, they do have a distressing, and by a bunch of Ferengi who didn't even know how to work the technology, no less.
Correct.
So Starfleet has bigger problems on their hands, it turns out. But that whole sequence through the crash landing on the planet, in my opinion, one of the most cinematic sequences in all of the Star Trek movies. More cinematic than anything you saw in, well, maybe not Motion Picture, because that's a very cinematic movie, but more cinematic than anything in Wrath of Khan, Search of Spock, etc., all the way through to Generations. It's a movie that is that takes advantage of a lot of the things that were and are still great about Star Trek. It uses the show's history and its lore and its canon to connect things together in a really interesting way. You know, the themes about Picard's family, which she set aside the slightly kinky Victorian Christmas fantasy that Picard has in the Nexus. Very weird, slightly off-putting. you set aside that piece of it, the like family theme that runs through the movie for him goes all the way back to Encounter at Farpoint. And Kirk and his, you know, on again, off again relationship with Starfleet and being in the action and that conversation between the two characters. Again, there's a lot of conversational dialogue between them that's kind of like, you know, stuff about the eggs. But once they're on the horses, after they jump over the ravine, that really profound scene where they're talking about what it means to be captain of the Enterprise. Don't let them promote you. Don't let them transfer you. Don't let them do anything that'll take you off the bridge of that ship, because while you're there, you can make a difference, is in one of the most profoundly, affectingly joyful exchanges in Star Trek history, and in my opinion. They squandered the opportunity in some ways to have these two characters meet, and they totally nailed it to the wall in others and hit a grand slam. And so it is sort of a movie of extremes in that way. There are some parts of it that are so good. Soren actually is a really interesting villain. I think he's one of the more interesting Star Trek villains that there are in the movies. They don't have a great track record of movie villains, frankly, and Soren, I think, is in the top 3 or 4 for me. He has an interesting motivation that's not just kind of world domination or destroy the Federation, right? It's a very personal...
He wants to be happy.
Right. He wants to be happy. It's pitiable, right? You pity him more than you hate him. He is doing hateful things, but as a means to an end, not because he's just a mustache twirling villain, like you know, Control became in Star Trek Discovery Season 2. And those scenes on Veridian 3 between Picard and Soren, it's our mortality that defines us, it's the truth of our existence. You know, the movie knows what it's trying to say about mortality and about family and about time. Time is a companion. It goes with us on the journey, reminds us to cherish every moment because it'll never come again. Speak for yourself, sir. I plan to live forever. Like there are some great bits of dialogue and it knows what kind of movie it is. And, you know, it misfires here and there in places, but, and there are a bunch of plot holes, and Kirk's death is stupid. But I love it. And for me, it kind of opened up this world. Star Trek Generations is the Marvel Cinematic Universe before anybody even conceived of that, right? The idea of having Kirk and Picard in the same movie together, and that people would like go out and see that and be interested to see these two characters who have never interacted before interact together on screen. Disney has Star Trek Generations to thank for their trillions of dollars at this point that they've made.
I want to challenge you, though, a little bit in a good way, I think. I want to rehabilitate for you Picard and the Nexus, even though I agree there's some weird bits in there. But I remembered reading a book when I was a senior in high school. I was required to read The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis. You ever read it?
Mm-mm.
So the whole idea is that the worst, and I'm summarizing a really long book that has a lot of ideas in it, and I'm going to horribly summarize it into just a couple sentences, but basically the worst temptation that Jesus ever gets from the devil is he tempts him with the opportunity to live a normal life.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, you can be a normal person, you can marry who you want to marry, you can have kids, you can have normal concerns about money and, you know, are my kids going to get sick? And, you know, sort of the normal pedestrian things that every sort of normal person might deal with. And you can have that life and just live small. And that's the temptation that gets him. And it's only at the end of that normal life that he repents. And he says, no, I reject all this and I embrace the fate that I was selected for, right? So it ends on sort of this hopeful message, like he chooses to go to the death, you know, and that's sort of what the book is about. And I think that what would you tempt Picard with? It's this idea that you could have a family that is not the Enterprise. You could have, you know, even in his own sort of weird, distorted, Victorian, strange English, French mishmash that's in his head, you can have that life and experience that and have it in the fullest, most pedestrian, normal way. And in a way, wouldn't that be tempting to the swashbuckling captain to have sort of this ordinary experience? Wouldn't that be glorious and wonderful? And so I found that actually, in a way, once I put aside the weird costumes and all that, I found it very moving, actually. And it's one of the scenes in the movie that actually makes I find most relatable. I know that that's probably unusual, and a lot of people are saying, John, what are you on about right now? But it is something that gets me.
Well, I think, and I might be jumping us ahead into our next episode, but in some ways that scene was done so much better by Tapestry from The Next Generation's sixth season, which is an episode where Picard dies and Q offers him the opportunity to go back and fix what he considers to be his biggest mistake, getting into the bar fight that gave him an artificial heart that ultimately ended up getting him killed on a diplomatic mission. But,
and I'm not trying to convince you anything, but I want to point out that in Tapestry, that was not a fulfilling life.
No, it was not.
Right? That's the difference, I think, is that there were rewards in that family experience that he didn't get, which I think is the contrast there.
But we also did not see him spend enough time in the family existence to decide whether that was a fulfilling life or not.
Could be.
I mean, for the 5 minutes that he spent there, I think he was like, oh, this seems pretty interesting. But there's also nothing to say that he wouldn't have spent 10 minutes there and gone, oh boy, I'm itching to get out of this place. Like, it turns out I hate my kids and I don't want to spend time with them. And like, this is awful, and take me back out to space. At which point, the Nexus would have changed it up again. But in Tapestry, he's given that chance to make that choice of fixing a part of himself that he feels a lot of melancholy over, and doesn't like the results, and decides to go back and change it. And I find that to be it's a Wonderful Life episode of Star Trek, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's an episode that is a really good episode, but it's an episode that reverberates more profoundly the older I get, because you do start to think about, when you watch this and you're 21, your life is still ahead of you. And so you're looking at an older man, look back on the choices that he's made on his life, but you don't feel that same pull that you do the older you get yourself.
Absolutely. Where
then you start thinking about, well, what if I was offered that choice, right? What if I decided to stay in the UK and not come to the US? How would my life would be totally different. One choice it sends the direction of your life in two entirely different directions. I never would have met my wife. I never would have had the kind of fulfilling career that I've had in the field that I have it in. I'm not saying it would have been a worse life, but it would have been a very different one. And everything about it would have been different. And that makes the episode more profound. It's not on the list, but an episode I hated growing up was Voyager's Real Life, where the Doctor creates a holographic family, and then Torres basically goes in and futzes with it to give him a real family experience. I hated that episode when I was younger because I felt absolutely no connection to it whatsoever. It meant nothing to me. There was no point of empathy or connection. I just thought it was a risible episode in which I hated everything about it. Now I really, really like it. I don't have kids, but I have a wife. I have and I realize how difficult it is that life is struggle and hard, and you can have amazingly fulfilling relationships, but that doesn't mean they aren't difficult. And it doesn't, nothing is that kind of perfect version of the family that the Doctor creates at the start, where you never get into fights about anything, and you never face challenge, and you never face, sad periods of your life. The way that we experience these episodes changes through the course of our life, and Tapestry is one of those episodes, and Real Life is one of those episodes where the more life experience you have, the more you connect with the characters. And so the episode itself takes on a new meaning for you in your own sort of individual journey through life and through the franchise.
I would completely agree with what you're saying there, Alex. And in fact, I think I'm having that very same experience, because as we record this, I'm getting very close to the end of Voyager. And the most recent episode I just finished was Homestead, which is, there's only 2 episodes left, right? I got Renaissance Man, and then I got the finale.
And I thought that Homestead was a glorious episode, and I love everything about the character of Neelix. And I've been I went into Voyager without knowing anything. So I just know, I'm supposed to hate this guy. Okay. And I watched the show and I'm like, Neelix is a great character. He's wonderful. He's glorious. And people are like, wow, Neelix is terrible. Haha, right? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I wish there were more Neelixes in the world. Right? He is so wonderful. And to see him at the end, and I realize this is something that may just have got me, but he ends up in a family situation, right? And he ends up having this sort of pre-made family with a little Talaxian kid. And I remember putting that screenshot up there of him with his, new, I don't know if they actually are married or not, but his like new main squeeze and the kid, and they're having this big hug. And I thought it was just one of the most tender moments I think I'd ever seen. And I remember writing out the words, a satisfying and wonderful end to a great character, right? And I remember thinking, yeah, I bet I would have had a very different reaction to this if I was 14.
Yeah, totally. Yep. Like, why did you go off the ship? Like, you went and live on some dumb asteroid when you had this like gleaming, starship with all these comforts at your beck and call. Like, what a horrible choice to have made. And now, I mean,
no, that was the right choice.
That choice.
Yeah, that was the right choice.
Totally.
I still object at the end of the 37s that no one wanted to stay behind.
Right.
That was the wrong decision. It's the wrong decision. And people are like, no, they're in Starfleet, man. This is like where people were telling me I have the wrong opinion of the show, right? Well, they're all in Starfleet, and they said everything. I'm like, you know what? Let's assume the Federation is a paradise. There's someone who probably said, well, I'm about ready to go do something else. I think I really want to be an architect. And
I've got no family. I've got no reason to go home other than everybody else wants to. So here's a perfectly fine opportunity. Like 200 people don't agree about anything ever,
including the Maquis, who never signed up for any of this to begin with.
Precisely.
It just totally shot the episode for me, and I was like, "This is stupid." And people are like, "No, that was great." And I was like, "Well, we're gonna disagree on that, my man."
Right. Yeah.
So let's talk about another unusual pick, which I was pleased to see is on the list. Trekkies, the documentary, Alex.
Yes.
Now you sent me on a little bit of a chase here, because unfortunately this movie is not available for streaming anywhere. And
so you tell me.
And like a filthy savage, I had to buy it on a DVD and actually get it shipped to my house like it was 1995 or something. But I did watch it in preparation for this, and I had seen it before many years ago, so it was nice to revisit it. Certainly a very interesting documentary that I think, as I watch it, it sort of walks a very careful line between celebrating the people that are the fans. But it could have, if a butterfly flapped its wings and like a sheet of paper had gone a little bit differently, it could have fallen into mocking these people. Mm-hmm. So it was like, we brought up Lord of the Rings before, right? It was on the edge of a knife the whole way. And I was watching it very critically, I have to admit, to see which way it went. I'm curious as to why you wanted to talk about it.
A lot of my picks are ones that like have challenged preconceptions, or which my relationship with has evolved over time. And this very much falls into the latter, but it's not my relationship with the show. It's my relationship with the fans. I hated this documentary the first time I watched it. I hated everybody on it. I thought they were stupid. I thought they were laughable. For me, that being on the knife edge between celebrating and mocking, my takeaway was that it was 100% mocking everybody on there, that they were all, because this was not what the documentary was telling me, this was what I was taking away from it, that I did not want to be these people, that I did not want to behave in the way that these people behaved in this documentary. Now, for context, I think the first time I watched it, I was like 17 and I'm now 32. And I have done a total 180 on Trekkies.
We're the people in the film, Alex.
I am the people in the film. And I was the people in the film at the time. And I was so uncomfortable with the idea that that was who I was, that I pushed back against it and became very spiteful about it and angry about it and rejecting of it. And that, kind of pushed itself further into when I was in college and decided I didn't want anything to do with the franchise as a whole. And, this wasn't what I wanted. And, I wanted to go in a different direction. Now, because I'm much more comfortable with myself as a person, like, that is who I am. I love those people. I want to spend time with those people. I want to know more about those people. I've tried to look some of them up, to see what's happened to them. I hope they continue to have happy, fulfilling, expressive lives of the things they love. I think that Trekkies to me now is such a joyous celebration of this eclectic and unique community of which I am an eclectic and unique member. I can't get enough. I watch it probably twice a year, and every time I feel more joyful about it. And there's no, there's no snark in me anymore about it. Even the guy who has created the character of the dead astronaut's wife from the Royale, and he's big into filking. Like, I love that guy. He was the one that was like top of the mocking list the first time around. And I feel terrible about myself for having had that reaction because it was so awful. But now, like, I want to be friends with that guy. I want to know more about him. I want to know who he was and I think, from what it turned out, he actually was kind of a bad dude and had a run-in with the law. But let's take a different, character. I would love to sit down and have a beer with her and talk more about. I hope I hope she's still around. I hope she's still a fan. I hope she still is as joyful about her experience as she was. I was the guy who had Star Trek all over his room and thought I would never open a dentist's, in which I would make it Star Trek themed. I'm going to Star Trek theme everything in my life from now on. Like, and totally proudly and outly and with no shame or anything. I love Trekkies, and I love now what it says about me as a fan. I hate what it says about what I used to be, but in the interests of, the importance of evolving as a person, I think this is an area where I'd like to think I too have evolved, and I'm one of the crew now. And Peter, this is the worst possible time you could have called. Go away.
I feel like we need to know if Gabe Kerner and Peter are still friends, and if this is something that they bring up from time to time. Remember that time I called you and you were on the film and you hung up on me?
Well, Gabe Kerner, there's a perfect example of somebody who you point your finger at and you say, oh, what a dumb little nerd, right? Hung up on these uniform issues and who, clearly has all these social problems and issues. The Enterprise D model from These Are the Voyages, the last episode of Star Trek Enterprise, that final shot of the Enterprise D leaving the nebula, that is Gabe Kerner's model of the Enterprise D. He made his dream a reality. And so, what a wonderful, joyous thing, and more power to him and more power to everybody on that documentary.
Yeah, it's, my live tweeting of books and Star Trek, even episodes that I really love, I give them some gentle snark because I try to be entertaining. I figure if you're going to follow me on Twitter, I try to give you some LOLs. I never try to be mean about it, but I was unable to summon even the mildest of snark for Trekkies, and I was like, I love this, I love that, I love this thing and that guy, I love that guy, and I just went through it and I loved it all. But I get you, man. Sometimes it holds up a mirror and you're like, oh, am I one of that? Is that me? I don't want to be that. And now you're like, nope. I'm that.
Right.
I was at as we record this, we're in the middle of this COVID-19 fiasco, and we're all working from home. And I was on a Zoom call with my colleagues at work today, and I'm talking to senior executives at a Fortune 500 firm. And I had my TOS background of the bridge of the Enterprise on the Zoom call. And I was like, this is who I am, Space Bros. This is it. This is how we roll up in here.
Yep.
And
out and proud.
This is what we're doing now, right? So it's people are holding up pictures of their cats. People are holding up pictures of getting their kids in the frame. I have kids. I have all that. But you know what? This right back here, that's what we're doing now. So,
exactly.
Yeah. So let's talk about one more set of episodes. Let's talk about Deep Space Nine, another twofer you've set up for me, Alex. Improbable Cause and the Die is Cast. Very unusual in that it has very little to do with our Starfleet characters. this particular twofer. So not a lot about the Federation in particular, not a lot about Starfleet, but certainly a lot of Cardassians, a lot of Garrick. As a former guest on my show, Andrew Heaton once said, the only character who only speaks in subtext.
Right.
And a lot of Odo. A lot going on here with the Dominion War. So tell me what's going on. What about this particular twofer challenged you or made it rise to the top?
Separate from a lot of the other episodes I put on, because it doesn't really challenge anything. It's just really good. They're probably my two favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine. And I think the thing that sets it apart from some of my other favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine, like The Way of the Warrior or Call to Arms, is that over the course of this two-parter, you get like at least two different kinds of story, right? It's a detective story, and then it's a political intrigue story, and then it's a war story, and they all kind of hang together over the course of 80 minutes in just this amazingly tight way. The character work is fabulous. The Garrick-Odo relationship is great. Those characters play off of each other so well. The idea of putting the Romulans and the Cardassians together was just a really interesting one. I think in some ways it is Star Trek at its most confident in using its source material in a way that is additive to the story and contributes to making it a better episode, right? There are plenty of episodes where canon and continuity can help hold things back. This is one of those episodes where it helps lift it up. The Romulans and the Cardassians forming an alliance to go and destroy the Dominion is the kind of thing that if you didn't know it was a two-parter of Deep Space Nine, it's the kind of things you would go, that's fan fiction, obviously, right? Like that's the kind of dumb thing that a fan would come up with. But they did it on the show, and they did it really well. And it was these different kind of stories, and it was a detective story where you slowly peel back the onion, and then you hit the reveal moment of this big fleet that goes through the wormhole, and then, the Defiant disobeys orders to go after them. It's just, there are few two-part episodes of Star Trek that give you as much over the 90 minutes as those two episodes do, and do it quite as well as they do in such a confident way that builds on all of this lore and pays it off for the fans who have been watching forever, right? Because you know who all these people are, you know why they matter, you know where those connection points are, and they do it in a way that new fans can find very accessible too. But if you are somebody who has been steeped in this stuff, who lives, breathes, eats, and sleeps it, this is the kind of episode where they're really just giving you everything that you want, right? And they're doing it in a way that's really good so that you can look back on that as a fan and you can go, oh my God, it really paid off to be a fan of this show, because I enjoyed this episode 10 times more than I think I would have coming into it, but not in such a way that it's totally inaccessible, right? Where everybody agrees they're great episodes, but if you're that kind of person who is really steeped in the franchise, you're going to draw just that much extra set of appreciation from it, because they do things in that episode that you yourself would have wanted to do if you were sitting down in front of a blank screen and you were like, Act 1, the Cardassians and the Romulans decide to destroy the Dominion, and then the story continues from there.
Alex, you talked about living, eating, sleeping, and breathing this stuff, and I assume you're talking about Star Trek.
Yes, sir.
Why?
That's a great question. I mean, I guess everybody has their sort of answer about a hopeful future, and certainly true that as it stands right now, we are in need of optimism and hope more than ever, right? I'm not sure when people will be listening to this, but as of today, it's April the 20th, 2020, and I am in day 41 of being inside my home as we go through the worst health crisis in the world since the 1918 Spanish flu. And Star Trek brings a lot of comfort in times like that. I think it has also been really important to me that it is a franchise that has done so much to explore itself and to justify itself and to say, all right, we're going to say these things and then we're going to show you how we got from A to B to C around that hopeful future, right? It's not Lothlorien, it's us. We got there by taking this path to get there. And that for me is immensely hopeful because, you know, we say we live in difficult times. I mean, we've lived in difficult times for like nearly 3 decades now. And
I would say for the
times
last
that there was before that.
3,000 years of human history.
Exactly, right? And so it gives that kind of hope and optimism. I think, you know, and that's sort of the high-minded answer. The more selfish answer is just that this has been a really important part of who I am since I was 6 years old. I don't have a lot of memories before that very vivid recollection of watching that last 10 minutes of A Matter of Time on BBC Two on what I think was a Tuesday night. It has been with me since then. It feels like a comfortable pair of slippers. I know it very well. I found in my professional career, there are 2 types of people. People who are comfortable knowing a lot about little, and people who are more comfortable knowing a little about a lot. And I am the person who likes knowing a lot about a little. And Star Trek is one of those things where I know a lot. And so I always feel comfortable with it. I know where I stand. I know who I am. And as I've gotten comfortable with that and expressing that, it has opened whole new worlds for me of friends and people and experiences like this. And the books that I have written and the places I have traveled and the things that I have seen and watched have profoundly moved me and touched me deeply and have given me something to aspire to and look forward to. And I hope that there is never a day when there is not new Star Trek for me to watch, to continue to challenge me, to comfort me, to give me more of this story and this universe that I have spent so long invested in. And we are in, as I say every week on Weekly Trek, a second golden age of Star Trek. And as far as I am concerned, may it never end. This has been one of the most important experiences of my life, and I'm not ready to get off this ride anytime soon.
Alex, I've enjoyed our conversation, and I hope that you have too, but the M5 is telling me that it's now time for the Kobayashi Maru.
All right, I'm ready, John. Let me just get my apple.
The Kobayashi Maru is a challenging and difficult test, cunningly prepared by the M5. Should you not only survive the test, but pass it as well, the M5 will award you an honorary Star Trek title. Are you ready, Alex?
I am ready.
M5, load the Kobayashi Maru simulator and prepare to record Alex's responses.
Working.
Question 1, Monster Maroons or Discovery Blues?
Monster Maroons.
Question 2, Lunch with Garrick or Tea with Picard?
Lunch with Garrick.
Question 3, Gilbert and Sullivan in the turbo lift or Caecilian opera in the sickbay?
Caecilian opera in the sickbay.
Question 4, what's a better way to spend your Quatloos? A third Dynasty Kurlan Nice Ghost with the figurines intact or the original Captain Picard Day banner?
The original Captain Picard Day banner.
Get that cheese to sickbay or no blah blah blah?
No blah blah blah.
Simulation complete. M5, please compute the results and tell us if our guest has passed the Kobayashi Maru.
Analyzing.
I'll tell you what. The reason I picked the Captain Picard Day banner over the Kurlan Naiscos is because even Picard decides he doesn't care much for the Naiscos, because in Generations, in the last scene, he picks it up when he's looking for his family album and he just tosses it to the side. But that Captain Picard Day banner, he kept that for nearly 30 years.
I will say this. I wanted to make sure I had something right from the episode. So I was looking up something online today for this, to prepare for this interview. And I found this YouTube video called like Picard and the Kurlan Nice Ghost, right? Uh-huh. And do you know the one I'm talking about? Where it like keeps cutting between the two. And he's like talking, this is the most important thing. Whoosh. This is the most, oh my God. And it just keeps cutting back and forth to him breaking the damn thing. Oh my God. That video had me in stitches today. It was very funny. Kurlan Nice Ghost, what the hell is this thing? All right. Well, Alex, I am pleased to tell you that the M5 has calculated that you have passed the Kobayashi Maru simulation. Congratulations.
Hooray!
And now, the M5, who has analyzed your answers, will award you an honorary Star Trek title on behalf of our podcast. M5, what title shall we award our guest?
Alexander Perry is awarded the title of Curator of Fandom Collections at the Federation Museum on Memory Alpha.
So there you go.
I am honored. Thank you, M5.
Alex, please tell people how they can get in touch with you if they want to continue the conversation.
Twitter is the best way to reach me. You can find my main account at Alexander T. Perry, and if you're interested in my weekly Star Trek news show, no longer than 40 minutes of all the best Star Trek news in all the land, you can find that over on the Tricorder Transmissions Podcast Network, and its Twitter account is at Weekly Trek.
As people know, we do not honor any time limits on this show. We go as long as it needs to be. Alex, thank you so much for being part of Trek Profiles.
It was my great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, John. This was an excellent experience.
Here ends this installment of the Trek Profiles podcast, and before we offer a Trek quote to close this episode, I'd like to remind you that you may send us your very own ideas for Kobayashi Maru lightning round questions, your thoughts on the exact explosive yield of a Mark VI photon torpedo, or selfie videos of yourself doing your best Klingon opera, or other comments to feedback@trekprofiles.com, or on Facebook or Twitter at Trek Profiles. Anything you send us may be used in the show, or it may be sent as tribute to an extra-dimensional, tentacled space AI intent on wiping out all organic life. This week, I leave you with a quote from Mr. Scott, who in the episode A Taste of Armageddon said, quote, "Of course, I could treat them to a few dozen photon torpedoes." Close quote. Thanks for listening, and live long and prosper.
This handcrafted podcast is brought to you by Stars and Sky Media Lab. It's cosmic.